Coleman let out an exhausted sigh as he stood at the head of the convoy, surveying the grim and pained faces of the villagers as they grieved over the lifeless corpse of their village leader. Some wept openly, while others covered their mouths as if trying to hold back the tide of emotion that threatened to overwhelm them. With Sophins, the villagers became a portrait of a shattered and lost community as they squabbled about what to do. Some petitioned to go back while they still could, while others thought it was best to send word to Afton so he could lead the convoy. But even in the depths of their grief and bickering, a glimmer of hope emerged. Danu, the blacksmith, stepped forward with a face etched with guilt and regret but also with a quiet determination. With a heavy heart, Danu placed a hand on Sophin's lifeless corpse. He closed his eyes, his lips moving in silent prayer, a plea for forgiveness and strength. The other villagers looked at him, their gazes desperate and pleading. They needed guidance, needed someone to help them navigate this unfathomable loss. "We continue to town," Danu bellowed, quietening everyone around him. "Sophin organized this here caravan and we should see it through." Turning away from the heartbreaking scene, Coleman let out a weary sigh. He reached up and removed his helmet, rubbing his eyes with a hand that trembled slightly. The weight of what they had done, the burden of the lives they had manipulated and destroyed, seemed to press down on him like a physical force. He turned towards Ian and Elijah, who were casually leaning against the LRPV, their postures relaxed despite the tension in the air. "I'm assuming they bought it?" Coleman asked, his voice low and strained. Coleman let out another sigh, a sound that was equal parts frustration and resignation. "I never wanted this to happen," he said, his tone heavy with regret. "I don't like the idea of whacking civilians just because they were doing something they believed was right, even if it went against our interests. And our operational security," Elijah added, wincing as Yana pulled at a few strands of his hair. A flash of anger flashed across Coleman's face as he shot him a quiet glare. But before he could respond, Ian chimed in, his heavy Australian accent cutting through the tension. "Mate, relax." It was buttery smooth, Ian interjected in an almost inappropriately cheerful tone, given the gravity of the situation. "We have cooperating witnesses, we have a fall guy, and we have someone with skin in the game." Coleman shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "Buttery smooth," he repeated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Is that what we're calling it now?" He shook his head but didn't bother to comment any further. A bout of silence passed as Ian and Elijah looked at each other for a few moments. They understood Coleman's reservations and his moral qualms. But they also knew that in the grand scheme of things, the success of their operation outweighed any individual life. Eventually, Coleman nodded, but he wasn't happy with how things went down. He knew that what they had done, while extremely abhorrent, was still necessary in the end. Another sigh left his mouth as he drifted towards the two prisoners being treated by the Australian medic in the back of the other LRPV. He then turned to Elijah and looked at him with an expression full of curiosity and apprehension. "What are you going to do with them?" he asked, his voice low and guarded. "I know you don't like leaving loose ends." Elijah broke the biscuit in half as his team leader spoke and lifted it up so Yana could get the other half. The little fairy fluttered down and snatched the thing out of his fingertips before settling down on his shoulder with a mischievous grin. The two took a bite out of their respective treats at nearly the same time. It was almost as if the two had become completely in the sync, and it brought both Ian and Coleman no end to their bewilderment. "Yeah, sure, whatever," Elijah replied with a full mouth and stared at Coleman with a completely bored expression. The team leader couldn't help but be dumbfounded by the two as his gaze shifted from Elijah to the little hellion kicking away happily on his shoulder. Shaking his head, Coleman then turned and made his way to the caravan and its new leader, Danu, to inform him of their next steps. Another sigh left Coleman's mouth as he prepared himself to take part in Elijah's machinations. "Fucking hell." In another plane of reality, Isael couldn't help but yawn deeply as she stepped out of a sleek, black SUV. The fatigue that had been building up was starting to affect her posture as she stretched her back out, eliciting a few satisfying cracks. The poor elf had found herself climbing into a metal tube and flying across these lands, meeting and later instructing several human scholars on the very fundamentals of the arcane. However, when they asked for her most powerful spell, she shifted nervously as she started to cast it. She wasn't the most powerful mage when it came to combat. Her specialty lay with understanding and manipulating the essence of magic itself, not causing destruction. Luckily, the human scholars seemed more than impressed with her pitiful display as she sent a bolt of pure arcane into a block of steel. The bolt had completely pierced it and sent arcane shards splintering in every direction on both sides, perforating everything else that lay near it. Azale half expected a few disdainful laughs while the rest pretended to cheer in disappointment, but to her surprise, everyone in the room erupted into ecstatic excitement. The celebration of her feat was so infectious that the woman couldn't help but flare in self-importance and put her hands on her hips while smiling smugly at the scholars. If there were one thing Azale could compare that experience to, it would be as if showing a tribe of uncontacted and isolated humans magic for the first time. Which, now that Azale thought about it, was exactly what it was. Albeit she was demonstrating her powers to an entire advanced civilization and not a tribe, the essence of the thought remained the same. Scratching behind her ear, Azale continued to slink tiredly towards an impressive structure with expansive glass facades reflecting the early morning sun as another yawn left her mouth. The building's design was a marvel of architecture, with its clean lines and geometric shapes creating a sense of elegance and authority. But as she approached, her tired eyes drifted over to a discreet plaque mounted off to the side that bore the inscription, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. As Azale made her way towards the imposing structure, an entire entourage of intense individuals who looked as if they stepped out of a high-stakes security detail surrounded her. Men and women in crisp dark suits moved with practiced efficiency, their eyes constantly scanning the area for any potential threats. Adding to the degree of protection, heavily armed guards in tactical gear shadowed them on every flank, their weapons at the ready. Azale couldn't help but feel a bit overwhelmed by the sheer level of security surrounding her. She was used to being treated with respect and deference back in her own world, but this was something else entirely. It was as if these humans viewed her as some sort of priceless treasure, something to be guarded at all costs. With not much farther to go, Azale came up to those infernal yellow sidewalk markers covered in small bumps, and lo and behold, she had stepped wrong on them yet again. The high heels of those strange professional pumps the mortal races seemed to like to wear slipped in an odd way, causing her to stumble forward. A yelp left her mouth as she nearly fell face first onto the ground, but a rather sizable human guard caught her just in time. "Are you okay, ma'am?" the guard asked, his voice filled with concern as he helped her regain her balance. Azale felt a flush of embarrassment as she straightened her blazer and brushed off her dark-colored skirt suit. Yes, I'm fine," she replied, trying to maintain any sense of dignity despite her near tumble. "Thank you." The guard nodded, and a hint of a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. He stepped back, allowing her to proceed towards the entrance. Azale couldn't understand for her life why the mortal races loved these infernal things. Beastkin, sun elves, and humans from both sides of this damnable rift loved these infernal things. She glanced down and glared at her high-heeled pumps while a frown tugged at her delicate features. Sure, they were fashionable and made one seem taller, but she never understood why anyone cared enough to be so uncomfortable while they walked. It seemed like a terrible price to pay for the sake of vanity, but Azale had never been one to prioritize appearance over practicality. As she reached the entrance of the building, Azale was greeted by a pair of guards who snapped to attention, and their postures ramrod straight. They opened the doors for her, ushering her inside with a level of deference that was only afforded to high-level dignitaries and officials. Nodding at the men awkwardly, Azale stepped into the lobby and took in another sleek and modern interior that seemed to come standard with every governmental building. Everything was pristine and polished, from the gleaming floors to the minimalist furniture. It was a far cry from the ancient, ornate structures she was used to back home. And to be honest, Azale almost longed for more decorative designs for her home. She had become sick of those too, but at least there was some variety. However, she did catch glimpses of other interiors inside of other buildings as her little convoy ferried her around the city. She'd love nothing more than to go exploring, wandering from building to building just to see what was in it. Suddenly, a woman in a crisp business suit approached her, a tablet in hand. "Welcome, Lady Azale," she said, her voice warm but professional. "We've been expecting you. If you'll follow me, I'll escort you to the briefing room." Azale nodded, trying to ignore the way her feet were already starting to ache in her uncomfortable shoes. She followed the woman down a series of hallways, and Azale couldn't help but glance at her guide's own choice of footwear. A wave of jealousy washed over the elf as she noticed the pair of stylish yet practical flats adorning the woman's feet. They seemed to accomplish the same task as Azale's own high heels without the horrid, uncomfortable design. The flats looked vastly more comfortable than whatever hell Azale was currently wearing. She found herself seemingly boring a hole through the attendants' feet as they rode the elevator up and traveled down a series of hallways. Azale silently cursed the fashion trends of both her own world and this strange, new one she found herself in. Finally, they arrived in front of a pair of imposing double doors. Azale took a moment to look around, finally noticing the flurry of activity as people went about their day at a dizzying pace. Most seemed to take a moment to gawk at her with wide eyes full of curiosity and wonder, before hurrying off to attend to their duties. A pair of guards stationed at the double doors checked a few IDs before opening the doors, allowing Azale and her guide inside. As she stepped into the room, Azale was greeted by the sight of a high-level meeting already in progress. The interior of the room was sleek and modern, with a large conference table dominating the center. Seated around the table were various individuals, each one exuding an air of importance and authority. At the head of the table sat a distinguished-looking man with salt and pepper hair and a neatly trimmed beard. He stood as Azale entered, a warm smile spreading across his face. "Lady Azale," he said, his voice deep and welcoming. "It's a pleasure to have you join us. I'm Dr. Marcus Tillman, the director of DARPA." Azale inclined her head, returning the smile. "The pleasure is mine, Dr. Tillman," she replied, trying to ignore how her feet were screaming in protest. Dr. Tillman proceeded to introduce Azale to the rest of the room. Having worked with the scientists and engineers from MIT, Caltech, and Stanford previously, she was already familiar with them. However, several new faces were in attendance. "Allow me to introduce you to our industry partners," Dr. Tillman said, gesturing to a group of well-dressed individuals. "We have representatives from Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, Northrop Grumman, Texas Instruments, and Raytheon here today." Each representative stood and greeted Azale in turn, their handshakes firm and their smiles polite. Azale couldn't help but feel a bit overwhelmed by the sheer amount of brainpower and influence gathered in one room. As everyone took their seats, the representatives from the various companies and institutions expressed their excitement at the prospect of working with her. "We're thrilled to have you here, Lady Azale," the representative from Lockheed Martin said, his smile genuine. "Your insights into the mechanics of magic could revolutionize our understanding of these phenomena." The others nodded in agreement, their faces alight with anticipation. Azale couldn't help but pound nervously in her chest. She thought she should tell them she wasn't exactly the most competent combat mage, but she kept her mouth shut. She knew that the expectations placed upon her were high, but Azale thought she should just sit and listen before opening her mouth. Dr. Tillman then motioned for the meeting began in earnest as he cleared his throat, his expression turning serious. "As you all know, we've been working with several magic users to better understand how magic works and how to measure it," he began, his gaze sweeping the room. "However, we've encountered some difficulties in grasping the finer details of the energies involved and how they interacted with, well, everything." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "Most of the mages and magic users we've worked with have been able to teach us basic spells and demonstrate the effects of the arcane. But when it comes to the underlying mechanics, the why and how of it all, they've struggled to provide clear explanations." The representative from Texas Instruments, a sharp-featured woman with keen eyes, nodded in agreement as she cleared her throat before speaking. "Yes, that's correct," she said, her voice crisp and professional. "Our colleagues in academia have spoken highly of your knowledge, Lady Azale. We're very much looking forward to your insights into the fundamental nature of magical energy." "Oh." Azale blinked in surprise as she peered around the room around her. She couldn't believe she wanted to learn about something she specialized in and not the usual destructive or enhancement spell most were known to pursue. Hell's even conjuration and illusion magic was a lot more interesting to pursue rather than unraveling and harnessing the very nature of magic. Then again, her field of study is highly frowned upon at the best of times and would get you stuck to a pyre at the worst of times. Azale took a deep breath, organizing her thoughts. "Thank you all for your kind words," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. Her expression then turned serious as she looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each representative. "But, before we proceed," she said, her voice low and cautious, "I feel I must warn you. The knowledge I possess, the understanding of the very essence of magic on a foundational level, is highly forbidden in my society. In other societies, it would be grounds for execution." The room was silent for a long moment, the weight of Azale's warning hanging in the air. Then, a man in a crisp suit, the representative from Lockheed Martin, leaned forward. His name tag read David Thompson. "Lady Azale," David said, his voice steady and assured, "with all due respect, we are not in your world. Any repercussions you would face for divulging this knowledge have no power here. The others nodded in agreement as Azale sat back in her chair, her look clear of surprise before it changed into slight embarrassment. Of course that was the case. The laws and taboos of her world held no sway in this realm. Here, she was free to pursue her studies without fear of retribution. A small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth as a sense of liberation washed over her. For the first time in her long life, she could truly delve into the mysteries of magic without constraint, without the constant fear of discovery and punishment. She looked around the room again, noticing the eager, determined faces at the table. "Very well," she said with a clear and strong voice. "What would you like to know?" Another sigh left Azale's mouth as she found herself back in the plush seat of the black SUV that had been ferrying her around. As the vehicle glided smoothly over a rather bland and featureless bridge, the monotony of the structures around her starkly contrasted with the whirlwind of meetings and discussions she had just left behind. Beside her, her assistant, a young woman named Maria, tapped away at her phone with her eyes glued to the screen. "Okay, so next up, we have a meeting at the Pentagon," Maria said with a crisp and efficient voice. However, Azale just looked at her blankly as if asking whether the assistant expected her to know what that meant. Maria then cleared her throat with flushed cheeks and corrected herself, ahem. "It's one of the country's main hubs for strategic and military thought." Nodding absently, Azale's gaze drifted back out of the window to the large river below. Another bridge stretched out in the distance, its design just as utilitarian as the one they were currently crossing. It was all so bland. Back in her world, even the most functional structures were imbued with a sense of artistry and aesthetics. But here, everything seemed designed with pure practicality in mind. But that seemed to make sense after seeing the dizzying array of vehicles passing them. Any bridge, gods, or even a road would be completely destroyed by the number of vehicles that pass over them. That wasn't even including the weight and size of what traversed these lands. Most of the cars and trucks were easily heavier than any mount in her world by a factor of 2 at minimum. But those were just the personal vehicles. Her gaze then shifted to yet another gargantuan vehicle called a semi-truck rumbling along the bridge as they passed it. After the Pentagon, Maria continued, oblivious to Azale's wandering thoughts, "We have a lunch meeting with representatives from Boeing and SpaceX. They're very interested in the potential applications of mana in aerospace engineering." Azale hummed an acknowledgement, but her mind only captured half of Maria's words. The elf couldn't help but yearn for a little more variety, a little more beauty in her surroundings. No matter where she looked, there was a constant parade of gleaming glass, cold steel, and gray concrete, and it was wearing on her. But as they entered the sprawling metropolis of Washington, D.C., Azale's eyes finally sparked with some life. Here, at last, was a break in the monotony. She found herself captivated by the fascinating stately columns, intricate pediments, and grand porticos that exuded a sense of timeless elegance and authority. It was as if these buildings seemed to harken back to an ancient era, their designs evoking a sense of history and tradition. Yet, the gleaming, glass and steel edifices of what these humans would consider contemporary were interspersed among these classic structures. These buildings, with their clean lines, geometric shapes, and innovative materials, spoke of progressive, forward thinking. After lunch, still engrossed in her phone, Maria continued to rattle off the day's itinerary. "We have a meeting with the Secretary of Energy to discuss the potential of mana as a renewable power source." Another absent affirmation left Azale's mouth as she remained fixated on the architecture around her. But as the convoy came to a stop at a red light, her attention was suddenly drawn to a charming little cafe on the corner. It was a quaint and inviting space, with tables spilling out onto the sidewalk. The cafe's patrons were leisurely enjoying a variety of dishes and drinks, which made Azale's eyes widen in jealousy. The elf took in the array of colors and textures of the confectionaries, while the steam rising from cups gave her a dose of nostalgia from her own hometown. Oh, how she longed to go in there! To sample every delicacy. To savor the flavors. To bask in the aromas of this world's cuisine. But before she could voice this desire, the light turned green, and the SUV lurched forward once more. As they drove on, Azale's hands nearly slapped against the tinted window, and her eyes remained on the cafe. Her gaze was drawn to other establishments that lined the streets. A florist shop, with its windows brimming with blooms of every hue, seemed to beckon her with its promise of natural beauty, a bookstore with shelves stacked high with tomes of every size and color. Maria, on the other hand, was still focused on her job as an assistant. The secretary-esque woman continued to outline the day's engagements. "Next would be a dinner meeting with the Joint Chiefs of Staff," she said. They're very keen on hearing your insights on military applications for magic. The most pressing would be detection and targeting. Isaelle suppressed a sigh. As much as she appreciated the opportunity to share her knowledge, the constant parade of meetings and discussions was starting to wear on her. She longed for a moment of respite, a chance to explore this fascinating city at her own pace. After a bit of scrolling, Maria narrowed her eyes as she found the conclusion of the busy day. And after the dinner meeting, you'll be driven back to your secure residence for the night. The Secret Service has arranged for a private, well-appointed space where you can rest and prepare for the next day's engagements. Maria continued, looking up at Isaelle as she stared out the window. Isaelle mumbled. At this point, the woman was on autopilot as her gaze remained fixed on the passing storefronts and restaurants. Her mind was miles away, lost in daydreams of steaming cups of coffee and flaky, buttery pastries. Noticing Isaelle's distraction, Maria set her phone down and raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, are you listening?" she asked with a hint of concern in her voice. Isaelle repeated, still not fully present in the conversation. With a gentle tap on Isaelle's shoulder, Maria finally managed to snap the elf out of her reverie. Isaelle nearly jumped in her seat as she turned to face her assistant with a startled expression. "Oh, I'm so sorry," Isaelle apologized, her ears drooping slightly in embarrassment. "I must have drifted off for a moment there." Maria huffed a few times in amusement, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "It's quite all right, ma'am," she said, her tone understanding. "You must be fatigued by all the hectic meetings. It's been a busy morning, and we still have a full day ahead." Isaelle nodded, but her gaze kept flicking back to the cafes and shops they were passing. The longing in her eyes was plain to see. Finally, she turned to Maria with a hopeful expression on her face. "Would it be all right if we stopped by one of these cafes?" She nearly whispered in a tentative tone. "Just for a little while?" The smile on Maria's face faded a little as she considered the request. As much as she wanted to accommodate Isaelle's request, there were protocols to follow and security concerns to consider. "I understand your desire, ma'am," Maria began, her tone gentle but firm. "But given your unique status and the sensitive nature of your work, we have to be very careful about public exposure." The elf's ears drooped further in disappointment from the reply, but it seemed Maria wasn't quite finished as the secretary tapped on her chin in thought. "However," Maria continued, "I think we can find a compromise. Let me make a few calls and see if we can arrange for a private visit to one of these establishments. We can have the place cleared and secured, and you can enjoy a bit of downtime without compromising your safety or identity." Isaelle's face lit up like a Christmas tree at the suggestion. Her eyes sparkled, and her posture straightened as she scooted closer to her assistant. "Really? Truly," she nearly yelled with a voice full of excitement. "You could do that?" Maria did her best to cover up her amused laugh as she nodded. This magically inclined being from another world was nothing short of adorable. The assistant soon nodded as she had already pulled up her contacts on her phone. "It might take a bit of coordination," she replied, "but for someone of your importance, I'm sure we can make it happen. Consider it a small thank you for all the invaluable knowledge you're sharing with us." A genuine, heartfelt smile spread across Isaelle's face as she clapped her hands in uncontained giddiness. Her ears seemed to spring as her expression seemed to light up the entire vehicle. "Oh, thank you, Maria," she yelled, hopping as high in her seat as her seatbelt would allow her. "That would mean the world to me." With Maria tapping away at her phone to make arrangements for a secure, private visit to a local cafe, Isaelle settled back into her seat. All the fatigue that welled within Isaelle seemed to be washed away with a wave of excitement as she heard her secretary speak to whoever ran these security details. A chance to actually sit somewhere lovely and eat some well-deserved confections was a small thing, a brief respite from the whirlwind of meetings and discussions. But to Isaelle, it meant everything. The SUV pulled up to their next destination as the thought of delicious sweets swirled within Isaelle's head. Looking up at the marvel in front of her, Isaelle gawked at the building's sheer size and unique design. The five-sided structure seemed to stretch on forever. And while the high elven cities of her homeland held more awe-inspiring structures, Isaelle had to remind herself that these humans made such a simple-looking structure exude strength and authority with just concrete and glass. It wasn't long until the SUV approached the Pentagon, and a flurry of activity erupted. The Pentagon's security personnel had been briefed on the VIP's arrival and the need for discretion, and the last thing they wanted was to draw unwanted attention to the fact that they were hosting an elf. It was one thing to have it be known there was such a being in custody, and a whole other matter of the fact they were working with such a being in one of the country's most secure and sensitive military installations. The uproar and international backlash would be nearly instantaneous, with a flurry of accusations flying in every direction. To avoid some issues, they opted out of pulling up to the main entrance and instead directed the SUV to a secure underground parking facility. The area had been cleared of all non-essential personnel, and additional security measures had been put in place to ensure privacy. As the vehicle came to a stop, a team of Secret Service agents quickly surrounded it. They were dressed in plain clothes, their earpieces and alert stances the only indications of their true role. With practiced efficiency, they escorted Azael through labyrinthine halls of the most coveted buildings of U.S. military leadership. Azael couldn't help but notice the curious looks of the few personnel they encountered. Even though she was wearing a sleek, modern suit like a lot of the other personnel, her elven features were impossible to fully conceal. Her pointed ears, ethereal grace, and slightly luminous skin was a stark contrast against the humans around her. But as she was whisked through the halls of the Pentagon, she also noticed the state of the offices and meeting rooms they passed. Every open door revealed a scene of controlled chaos, with empty and half-full pizza boxes and coffee cups strewn about. It was clear that the personnel here were working around the clock, dealing with some sort of ongoing crisis. This was only compounded by the curious yet haggard faces of the people they passed. Despite her unusual appearance, most seemed too preoccupied with their own tasks to give Azael more than a passing glance. It was as if the entire building was operating under a state of extreme pressure that Azael couldn't really fathom. As they approached a set of double doors, Azael's keen elven hearing picked up a snippet of conversation between two individuals who were power-walking down the hall. Their voices were tense, their words rapid and clipped. "The Chinese are starting to posture more aggressively in the Pacific," one of them said, his brow furrowed in concern. "They're accusing us of neo-imperialism and demanding entrance into the portal." The other individual, a woman with a severe bob cut, shook her head. "And the Russians are getting angsty, too," she replied, her tone exasperated. "They keep demanding a UN-coordinated response, saying it irresponsible that this is a US-led endeavor and it's a threat to the entire planet." Azael couldn't quite grasp the full context of the conversation she overheard, but from what she gathered, there seemed to be an ongoing geopolitical crisis centered around the rift. The mention of Chinese and Russians, which she assumed were other kingdoms or entities in this world, and their demands for involvement or oversight hinted at a complex web of international tensions. A hum of interest left Azael's mouth as she tried to piece together the implications. But before she could ponder further, she was ushered through a pair of heavy double doors and into a meeting room filled with a group of rather important-looking individuals. As she entered, the people around the table stood, their postures straight and their expressions serious. One by one, they introduced themselves as members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest-ranking military officials in the United States. After a round of polite but brisk greetings, they got straight to the point. "Lady Azael," the chairman of the Joint Chiefs began, "the main goal of this meeting is to determine the tactical and strategic threats we need to address regarding the empires and their use of magic on the other side of the rift." He paused, giving his colleague an intense glance. "We know we've gone over this with you before, many times, Lady Azael. But we hope that underscores just how critical this topic is. The security of our nation and the world at large may depend on the insights you can provide." Azael fidgeted a few moments before nodding nervously. A part of her was still apprehensive of these kinds of meetings. It was almost as if she was betraying her own world, but as long as their guns and bombs were aimed directly at the Seraphic Empire and not her people, then she had little qualms about it. Nodding solemnly, Azael met the chairman's gaze. "I understand," she said, her voice steady. "As long as you make the distinction that the High Elven people are not the Empire, then I have little issues with delving deeper into the topic." The military leaders nodded back. "We are not in the profession of wanton destruction. If your people remain neutral and do not intervene in our conflict with the Empire, then we will not touch an inch of their land," he replied. It was the same song and dance as last time. As long as everyone stayed in their lane, then there was no need to come to blows. As a matter of fact, as we said last meeting, I'm sure our diplomats would be more than ecstatic to set up trade or even cultural exchanges with the High Elven Council. The chairman continued, folding his hands on the table. "There's quite a bit we'd be eager to learn, and there's also quite a bit we'd love to teach." That was the same answer as last time, but the words still did a lot to ease Azael's heart as she visibly relaxed. The elf let loose a deep breath, steeling herself once more, and began the meeting in earnest. Again, for hours, Azale found herself answering question after question until these important men were satisfied and left her throat hoarse and dry. And by the time it was finally time for her to head back to her transport, the poor elf felt mentally and emotionally drained. The knowledge she shared seemed to weigh down on her heavily. These humans were terrifyingly clever. It was apparent that centuries of constant warfare had shaped their decision-making on an institutional level. Whatever Azale had shared over the months was going to be used to shape the course of her world, forever. With everything all said and done, Azale heaved a heavy sigh as she made her way back through the labyrinthine halls of the Pentagon. Her Secret Service detail surrounded her once more as they descended into the underground garage and approached her waiting SUV, and she couldn't help but feel relieved. Any place that was the nerve center for secrets and plots was someplace that Azale wanted to be as far away from as possible. However, the elf knew that was going to be an impossibility for the foreseeable future. Another sigh left Azale's mouth as she neared her designated vehicle, and she was greeted by the sight of her appointed assistant standing right next to the SUV with a broad smile on her face. As Maria opened the door for her, Azale half expected the woman to rattle on about another meeting or a change in plans, but lo and behold, the cheeky woman had good news for once. "Our change in plans has been approved, Lady Azale," Maria announced in a bright and chipper voice. Azale's eyes widened, and a spark of excitement filled her gaze as she snapped her head to her assistant. Maria herself was unable to control her grin at the elf's adorable reaction. It was like watching a child being told they were going to their favorite candy store. "That's right," Maria continued, her own enthusiasm feeding off Azale's. "Everything's been arranged for your private cafe visit. The Secretary of Energy is looking forward to meeting you there for a lovely lunch. And get this, it's not just any cafe. It's an adorable little cat cafe with a beautiful garden inside." A squeal of delight left Azale's mouth as her hands came up to her face, and she practically bounced on her feet. "Oh. A cat cafe. I've only seen those creatures from a distance or on a screen," she clapped, her voice filled with wonder. "With a garden? Oh, Maria, that sounds absolutely perfect." Charmed by Azale's unabashed joy, Maria's smile widened as she opened the door of the SUV. Moments like these reminded her of just how unique and special her charge was. Despite being a veritable ancient and immensely powerful magical being, Azale still found such pure, innocent delight in the simple pleasures of life. "The Secret Service is already en route to secure the area and prep for your arrival," Maria assured her. "Everything should be in order by the time we get there. You'll have plenty of time to enjoy the cafe, play with the cats, and relax in the garden before the secretary arrives." Azale was practically vibrating with excitement, and her earlier fatigue and stress were wholly forgotten. "Cats and a garden," she repeated as if trying to convince herself it was real. After all those meetings, all that time cooped up inside. "Maria, you're an absolute goddess, do you know that?" Maria felt warm and fuzzy at Azale's words. "I'm happy to make your day just a little more tolerable, Lady Azale," she replied modestly. "You're doing such important work that is helping keep not only my family safe but also countless other families. It's the least I can do to make things a little brighter for you." As they climbed into the SUV, Azale was still gushing about the cafe, her eyes sparkling with anticipation. "Do you think they'll let me pet these cats?" she asked, her voice filled with hopeful longing. "I've always wanted to pet a cat from your world. They look so soft and fluffy in the pictures I've seen." Shaking her head in amusement, Maria laughed affectionately. "I'm sure they will, Lady Azale," she assured her. "In fact, I've heard that the cats at this particular cafe are very friendly and love attention from visitors. You might even get to play with some of the kittens, if you're lucky." Azale let out another squeal at that, actually clapping her hands in glee. "Kittens," she exclaimed. "Oh, Maria, this is going to be the best day ever. I can feel it." As the SUV pulled out of the Pentagon's underground garage and merged into the busy DC traffic, the two made their way to their next meeting point to discuss the potential uses of magic in energy generation. And, of course, to eat confections and pet a cute cat or two. The Senate chamber was filled with palpable tension as the hearing on the new bill began. The proposed legislation, drafted and sent by the House of Representatives, was a law enforcement empowerment measure aimed at creating an overarching joint task force. This task force would allow federal and state law enforcement to respond to and combat the growing anomalies in the United States from beyond Ohio's rift. Senator Derek Sutton, a Republican from Georgia, was the first to speak. He began calmly, albeit with an edge of scorn in his voice. He still followed the traditional decorum of Senate hearings. This measure, Senator Sutton stated, is both overreaching and ineffective. Our law enforcement agencies are already stretched beyond their means, dealing with these otherworldly threats. Sure, they're not even in a position to abuse it due to being stretched too thin, but why give them the opportunity to violate our constitutional rights in the future? What we need is our goddamn National Guard and our military defending our people. The assembled senators and audience met his words with applause and murmurs. It was clear that Sutton's sentiment struck a chord with many who felt that the proposed measure was both inadequate in the face of the looming threat and a slippery slope. However, Senator Sarah Fletcher, a Democrat from Washington, was quick to counter Sutton's argument. With all due respect, Senator Sutton, Fletcher began in a measured but firm tone, we cannot afford to move any personnel from the rift, especially with a looming offensive on the horizon. Our forces are already at maximum capacity. The reserves have been called up, the National Guard has been activated, and every able veteran has been recalled. We've done everything short of a full-on draft. Fletcher paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. This task force is not meant to replace our military, but to supplement it. By empowering our law enforcement with the authority to execute raids without warrants and set up no-go zones to deal with the domestic anomalies, we can free up our armed forces to focus on the larger threat beyond the rift. Senator Sutton, however, was not convinced. He leaned forward in his seat, his face flushed with anger. Supplement, he scoffed. Senator Fletcher, giving law enforcement the ability to establish de facto martial law is absurd. He threw his arms up in outrage. That's not going to keep our people safe. Have you seen the reports coming out of these affected areas? While you West Coast yuppies are sittin' comfy behind your fucking mountains, people are disappearing and dying as we speak. The Georgian senator stood up and was losing his temper. I have farms being overrun by monsters. I have children being snatched from playgrounds and elementary schools. College students are being dragged down into sewers in the middle of the street. Hell, Mrs. Fletcher, these filthy monstrosities are even eating people in their own homes. The man stood up and slammed his hands on the table while pointing at Senator Fletcher. We don't need our freedoms stripped away. We need overwhelming force to exterminate these vermin. Fletcher stood up abruptly, her face flushed with anger as she pointed accusingly at Senator Sutton. We have no one left to deploy, she yelled over the din of the assembly. Every available soldier, reservist, and National Guard member are all at the rift. Senator Terry Wagner, a Democrat from Illinois, spoke up to join the fray. For God's sake. As Senator Fletcher said, we've recalled every able-bodied veteran, and we've done everything short of a full-scale draft, he shouted, his voice filled with frustration. Do you want to be the one to spearhead a draft? Or should we compromise the entire safety of the nation by dragging away critical units and creating gaps in our front lines? But Sutton was not to be outdone. He slammed his fist on the table, his face red with rage. That's not good enough, he bellowed. Our people are dying out there. We need more boots on the ground, and we need them now. The Senate Majority Leader, Senator Robert Thompson from Kentucky, banged his gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order. Senators, please, he yelled, his voice straining to be heard above the shouting. Order! Order! However, his efforts were in vain. The debate had devolved into a full-blown shouting match, with senators from both sides of the aisle standing up and yelling over each other. Accusations and insults flew back and forth, drowning out any attempt at reasoned discourse. In a living room hundreds of miles away, a sun-kissed man named Bruffin bitterly, with bright blonde hair and a clean-shaven face, shook his head as he watched the Senate hearing on TV. After the rift opened, the entire country lost its mind. Every day, the county was flooded with sirens and helicopters rushing to one crisis after another, with no end in sight. These monsters were everywhere, and they even roamed brazenly during the day. And if you didn't find one sneaking around in broad daylight, you sure as hell would find them in the sewers and drainage systems. It was a nightmare for the East Coast and Middle America, a nightmare that Bruffin knew would eventually affect the rest of the country. But he also felt like he had an answer for it. Looking around him, Bruffin saw his friends leisurely hanging about, snapping rounds of ammunition into magazines as they prepared for another day of fighting the monsters that had invaded their town. They had set up their own local militia and soon-to-be private security firm to respond to these crises. Gearing up, organizing, and transporting people to hotspots that would pop up was an expensive venture, but as a popular gun YouTuber, Bruffin had an advantage most didn't. Bruffin was already in a position to organize people and get the okay from the local county in Texas. He already had enough weapons to arm a small army. He also had the transports in the form of small helicopters, trucks, and Polaris ATVs they'd use to hunt hogs. They were in the perfect position to provide a solution where the state couldn't. "Look at him," Bruffin said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Arguing and bickering while we're out here actually getting shit done." Typical. His friend Marcus, a dark-skinned, burly man with a thick beard, grunted in agreement. "They don't have a clue they're doing," he said, placing a magazine into the pile. "They're too busy playing their political games to be of any use." Greg, a pale, lean man with a baby face, nodded as he looked up, loading magazines as well. "It's like the Wild West all over again," he said, a hint of excitement in his voice. "We can't count on the government to save us. We've got to take care of ourselves, just like the pioneers did." There was a glint in Greg's eye as he spoke, a hint of adventure. "In a way, it's kind of exciting," he continued. "Being out there on the frontier, facing down these monsters, relying on our own skills and wits to survive." But then his expression sobered, and he shook his head. "Still, it's a damn shame it's come to this. We pay our taxes, but what do we get? A bunch of suits in Washington arguing while the country goes up in flames." Bruffin sighed, running a hand through his hair. "That's just how it is, man," he said. "When the chips are down, when things really go to shit, it's always the common folk who have to step up." Just as those words left Bruffin's mouth, a teenager suddenly burst into the room with a phone clutched tightly in his hand. "Uncle Brew, you got work," he yelled, running over to hand the device to his uncle. Taking the phone from his nephew, Bruffin furrowed his brow as he quickly scanned through the information on the screen. A huff was forced through his nose, and a serious expression settled over his face. "Greg," he barked, his voice sharp with urgency. "Take the trucks and your boys to Wilt's farm. They found more of those scaly bastards stealing livestock." Not wasting any time, Greg shot up and started shoving the preloaded magazines into pouches, before rushing out of the room. "On it, boss," the man shouted before barreling out of the door, already shouting out orders to his men. "Marcus, you're with me," he said, grabbing his plate carrier to gear up. "We've got a mix of lizards and mangy vermin out by Lakeside. We're taking the helis." Marcus nodded as he threw on his own plate carrier and started shoving magazines into pouches. "Roger that," he replied, bolting out of the house as well after grabbing his rifle. As Bruffin geared up, he continued to parse through the information on his phone. On the screen, a newly developed open-source app called the Minutemen. The Minutemen were explicitly designed to aggregate attacks and organize civilian responders. Everyone from mall cops, private security firms, militias, and even private military contractors got in on the action and were referred to as Minutemen. It essentially crowdsourced first responders. The Minutemen app was a work in progress, with a rough and unintuitive interface, but it still provided a real-time map of the entire state of Texas. When one viewed the map, they'd quickly see that the whole state was peppered with exclamation marks, each one indicating an incident that required their attention. These alerts were constantly updated, providing a live feed of the crisis situations unfolding across the region. But when Bruffin honed in on his city, San Antonio, he said it was lit up by single flashing police light icons indicating law enforcement was already handling the incidents. It was a helpful tool, allowing them to prioritize their response and avoid redundancy. However, 2 other incidents remained unattended, and their exclamation marks strobed urgently on the map. One was at Wilt's farm, the location Greg and his team were already speeding towards. The other was in the suburbs of Lakeside, the destination for Bruffin and Marcus. Bruffin tapped on the Lakeside alert, bringing up additional details, and the app began to work its magic in the background. Not only were pictures from the service requester provided, but the Minutemen app crawled the internet, searching for similar images that were geotagged in the area and taken within the same timeframe as the request. Within seconds, a series of additional images populated the screen, providing more context to the job and a comprehensive visual of the situation on the ground. Bruffin's eyes widened as he took in the new information. His fingers deftly allocated the request to his makeshift militia with a few quick taps. But as he continued to study the images, something caused him to pause. Amidst the chaos and destruction, he noticed a disturbing mix of creatures, both the feral and vicious scroungers that had become public enemy number one and the kleptomaniac kobolds. This was highly unusual. Scroungers were known for their territorial aggression and brazenness in attacking people in broad daylight. They were apex predators, feared by humans and monsters alike. Kobolds, on the other hand, were more of a nuisance than a lethal threat. They were notorious for their thievery and mischief, always seeking to make off with shiny objects or someone's livestock. But they typically avoided direct confrontation, preferring to avoid humans, and were content to hunt the plentiful hogs and deer. Nevertheless, they were still dangerous and attacked when cornered. Seeing these two vastly different species operating in the same location sent alarm bells ringing in Bruffin's mind. Scroungers and kobolds had never been known to work together before. In fact, their behaviors and motivations were so contrasting that they were more likely to clash than cooperate. Something wasn't adding up. There was a piece of the puzzle missing, a factor he couldn't quite grasp. But as the sound of helicopter rotors starting to spool up outside reached his ears, Bruffin knew he didn't have the luxury of time to figure it out now. With a frown, he shoved his phone into his pocket and grabbed his rifle. The specifics would have to wait. Right now, they needed to get to Lakeside and put an end to whatever the hell was going on before more lives were lost and houses burned down. Bruffin sprinted outside towards the awaiting helicopters as a crowd of armed men piled inside both birds, an old Bell 212 and a Bell 206. Without hesitation, he jumped into the Bell 212, his rifle slung across his back. Turning to the pilot, Bruffin spun his finger in a circle and yelled, "Let's go." One of the militiamen leaned forward into the cockpit, smacked the pilot in command's shoulder, and relayed the order. The pilot immediately nodded and pulled up on the collective to take off. San Antonio Tower, this is Minuteman Bravo Golf 32, a Bell 212, and Minuteman Bravo Golf 33, a Bell 206, departing Bitterly Compound to the west. We are a flight of 2, VFR, visual flight rules, to Lakeside, responding to a crisis situation. Requesting priority clearance. The radio crackled to life as the tower responded. Minuteman Bravo Golf 32, San Antonio Tower. Roger, your request. You are cleared for immediate departure to the east. Maintain VFR at or below 1,500 feet. Squawk 1-2-0-0. Priority handling is in effect. Godspeed. Cleared for immediate departure to the east, maintain VFR at or below 1,500, squawking 1,200. Minuteman Bravo Golf 32 copies all, rolling now. After the formalities were completed, the pilot skillfully lifted the Bell 212 into the air, the Bell 206 following close behind. The two helicopters quickly gained altitude, their powerful rotors churning the air as they set course for Lakeside. Bruffin and his men were already preparing for the job inside the helicopters. They checked their weapons, ensured their comms were working, and mentally steeled themselves for whatever awaited them. As the helicopters raced towards Lakeside, Bruffin couldn't help but marvel at just how much had changed as his mind drifted. Just a few months ago, these skies were a picture of serenity. The occasional police helicopter would do its rounds or circle over an area, but otherwise, the airspace was largely clear and peaceful. Now, however, the sky was abuzz with activity. Small prop planes, helicopters, and drones flew in every direction, a testament to the new threats their society faced. The rift had changed everything, and the airspace was no exception. The noise rules the FAA once enforced had been largely disregarded in the face of this new reality. The priority now was rapid response, getting eyes on target and boots on the ground as quickly as possible when a crisis emerged. Red tape and regulations had taken a backseat to the pressing need for swift action. As Bruffin mused on these changes, a tap on his shoulder jolted him from his reverie and brought him back to the present. One of his men leaned in close, pointing at the pilot with his thumb. "Boss, the pilot says we're 1 minute out," the man shouted, trying to overpower the sounds of the whipping rotor blades. Acknowledging the update with a nod, Bruffin then grabbed one of the handles inside the helicopter and planted his feet firmly on a strut on the skid before leaning forward. The man squinted his eyes as he peered out in front of the helicopter in an attempt to get a better view of what was going on and where they were heading. Sure enough, just a mile or two ahead, billows of smoke followed by flashes of arcane energy that clashed with the afternoon sun erupted from the suburbs they were racing towards. The scene was chaotic and destroyed as smoke filled streets and skies. With a grunt, Bruffin pulled himself back into the helicopter and immediately began issuing orders. "Listen up," he barked as they made their final approach. "We're going to land in the cul-de-sac. The 206 will provide overhead support. Stay sharp, watch your sectors, and remember your training." He shouted as men checked their weapons and gear, readying themselves for a potential hot landing. One of the militiamen, however, pulled out a radio and immediately began relaying the orders to the other helicopter. As the Bell 212 approached the landing zone, the pilot expertly maneuvered the aircraft by flying it low and fast. They were so low that the rotor wash kicked up dust and debris from the rooftops, creating a swirling vortex behind them. The pilot flared the nose up, bleeding off as much speed as possible before gently setting the aircraft down in the middle of the cul-de-sac. Just as the helicopter's skids touched the pavement, Bruffin and his men jumped into motion. They had drilled this maneuver countless times, each man knowing his role and position as they moved forward, scanning their sectors. The militiamen fanned out, training their weapons on potential threats as the helicopter kicked off the ground and took off to join its sister aircraft circling above. The Bell 206 remained in a holding pattern with snipers in its cabin, providing a watchful eye and rattling off shots from above while Bruffin and his team moved deeper into the battlefield. More gunfire erupted from him and his team, ending any kobold or scrounger that were lingering out in the open while they maneuvered on the suburb. As they cleared the street 1 yard at a time, the true extent of the carnage became apparent. Bodies littered the streets, but as Bruffin looked closer, he realized something was off. Among the scattered corpses, only one of them appeared to be human. The poor soul's mangled corpse was strewed about in a grotesque way in the middle of the street. Even from a distance, Bruffin could see the severity of the wounds. Deep gashes crisscrossed the corpse, and chunks of flesh appeared to have been torn away as if the body had been feasted upon. The barbarity of the injuries was a clear sign of the scrounger's viciousness. But the vast majority of the bodies weren't even human. As Bruffin and his men moved cautiously through the suburban streets, the scene before them was one of utter devastation. The bodies of kobolds and scroungers littered the ground from what must have been a brutal and vicious melee. But something about this scene felt off from the usual encounters with these creatures. Bruffin had been fighting these monsters since the rift first appeared, and in all that time, he had never heard of kobolds and scroungers even whispered in the same sentence, let alone be seen near each other. It was well known that kobolds and scroungers rarely, if ever, interacted. Kobolds, with their small, wiry frames and quick, furtive movements, were natural scavengers. They preferred to steal and run rather than engage in direct confrontation. Their survival instincts were geared towards avoiding conflict, especially with creatures that could easily overpower them. Scroungers, on the other hand. These larger, more aggressive creatures were easy for a teenager to handle, but usually hunted in packs and lived in tribes with their own makeshift cultures. To make matters worse, they chose to stalk and hunt humans, even in large cities, by making their lairs in sewers or drainage pipes. The two species occupied vastly different niches in the ecosystem of this new, post-rift world, and they typically avoided each other. Seeing them here, not just in the same neighborhood but actively fighting and killing each other, was unheard of. It contradicted everything Bruffin and his men had come to understand about these creatures and their behavior. As Bruffin and his team moved deeper into the suburb, the evidence of this strange and deadly interaction became more apparent. Kobold spears protruded from scroungers' corpses, while the telltale marks of scroungers' jagged makeshift blades and claws marred the bodies of fallen kobolds. It was as if these two species, usually so distinct in their habits and habitats, had suddenly decided to seek each other out and clashed in a frenzy of unprecedented violence. Or, perhaps this was always the case, and they just now noticed? Bruffin narrowed his eyebrows as his mind raced with possibilities. Was this a chance encounter and scuffle for resources? Or had the kobolds and scroungers, creatures that had always maintained a wary distance, actively sought each other out and engaged in a brutal conflict? Shaking his head, Bruffin dismissed these thoughts for the moment. Figuring out the underlying cause of this anomalous behavior would have to wait. Right now, he had a job to do. Sporadic bursts of gunfire erupted across the once quiet lakeside suburb as the Minutemen methodically cleared the area. They moved from house to house, garage to garage, yard to yard, ending any threats they saw. Occasionally, they would spot a curious face peering out from behind a curtain or catch the glint of a phone camera recording their progress, but they did their best to ignore the perusers. The residents were no doubt terrified by the sudden attack and seemed only to poke their heads out when the influx of armed men entered their neighborhood. The streets, however, remained largely deserted, save for the occasional scrounger that would dart out from cover only to be promptly cut down by a hail of bullets. As Bruffin moved through the suburb, his eyes scanned around to take the carnage. The bodies that littered the streets and yards were scroungers. This fact alone was enough to give him pause. Despite being outnumbered by the scroungers, the kobolds gave as good as they got. For every kobold corpse, there were at least 2 dead scroungers. It was an impressive kill ratio, especially considering the physical disparities between the two species. Kobolds were small and wiry, built for speed and stealth rather than direct combat. But scroungers, on the other hand, were vicious and strong. Those mangy beasts should easily be able to overpower a kobold in a straight fight, let alone disembowel one with its sharp claws and teeth. Yet, the evidence before him told a different story. The kobolds held their own and seemingly inflicted a terrible cost on the scroungers in this apparent skirmish. It was a testament to their ferocity and their determination, traits that Bruffin had never really associated with those scavenging little pests before. As he pondered this new development, a sudden movement caught his eye. A scrounger, its fur matted with blood, was trying to scurry from one bush to another, seeking cover or escape. Without hesitation, Bruffin snapped his rifle towards the creature and opened fire. The scrounger convulsed as the bullets tore into its body, its limbs jerking in a macabre dance. Its momentum took it a few more steps before it collapsed face-first into the ground, its lifeblood seeping into the carefully manicured lawn. Approaching the downed creature, Bruffin stepped around the large bush the thing had been running towards with Marcus close on his heels. As they rounded the foliage, they were greeted by a sight that made their blood run cold. 3 more scroungers were lying in wait, and one was mere steps away from Bruffin. Without hesitation, Bruffin started firing, emptying the remainder of his magazine into the horrible beast. But the scrounger was already in motion, lunging at him with its razor-sharp claws and snapping jaws. Meanwhile, Marcus reacted with equal swiftness, dumping the remainder of his magazine into the other 2 scroungers charging towards his boss. The rapid burst of violence only lasted a few seconds as the air filled with the barks of gunfire, mingling with the screeches of the dying creatures. But Marcus' attention was immediately drawn back to Bruffin, who grappled with the scrounger that had pounced on him. The creature was desperately thrashing and gasping after eating half a magazine's worth of rounds just before it stabbed a jagged piece of metal into Bruffin's tactical gear. Marcus ran forward, grabbing the scrounger by its matted fur and effectively tossing the damned thing across the yard with a grunt of effort. As the little beast continued to writhe, Marcus pulled out his pistol and fired 5 more rounds into it, causing the scrounger to stiffen up and cease its struggle. "Brew, you good?" the dark man asked, snapping his weapon between the motionless scrounger and the 2 creatures sluggishly squirming on the ground. Bruffin flailed and kicked, putting some distance between himself and the corpse, before patting himself down, frantically. "Fuck," he yelled, clearly shaken by the close call. "God damn it, man. Yeah, my fucking plate caught it." Bruffin finally answered in anger as he paced back and forth. "Goddamn piece of shit." He shouted one more time, before taking a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. With the burst of adrenaline starting to dissipate, Bruffin and Marcus took a moment to reload their weapons. They approached the downed scroungers cautiously, putting a few more rounds into each of them to ensure they were truly dead before they took the time to examine the corpses a little more closely. As they got closer, they noticed something peculiar. Besides the bullet wounds that riddled their bodies, one of the scroungers barely showed any signs of damage other than being a little beat up. One of them, however, had an arm that was burned to a crisp. Its flesh was blackened and cracked, while another had its snout almost completely frozen solid, encased in a sheath of ice. Bruffin furrowed his brow, his mind racing. Scroungers didn't have any innate magical abilities, at least not that they had ever encountered before. These injuries, the burns, and the freezing had to have come from an external source. But what could have caused such damage? "Brew, come take a look at this." Marcus beckoned to his boss, his voice a mix of disgust and unease. Moving over to where Marcus stood, Bruffin's eyes followed his friend's gaze. What he saw made his stomach turn. Kobolds' heads were dangling from hooks at the sides of the 2 scroungers. Their lifeless eyes stared blankly into the distance. It was apparent they had been taken as trophies, grim tokens of the scroungers' victory over their enemy. The 2 men could only stare at the grisly sight for a moment as a heavy silence hung between them. "I don't think they like each other very much." Marcus spoke up with his face twisted in a mix of disgust and bewilderment. But the questions remained. Why here? Why now? What had sparked this sudden and brutal battle? Bruffin turned to his friend with furrowed brows, before looking back at the pair of heads. That had been the understatement of the year, he mused silently. The grisly trophies, the signs of magical damage, the sheer number of scrounger corpses, it all pointed to a conflict. It gave a similar feeling to that of a gang war fighting over territory. Gunshots continued to echo throughout the suburb as other teams encountered more pockets of resistance. Marcus's clip-to-his-hip radio chatter painted a picture of the wider battle. Team 2, reporting in. Engaged another cluster of scroungers. Count is 7, all Kia. Team 4 here. We've just smoked a dozen more in the park. Bruffin couldn't help but marvel at the numbers. Jesus, he muttered, how many of these things are there? Marcus, his face grim, grabbed his radio. Hey, any y'all find any live kobolds? There was a moment of silence, then a crackle as responses came in. Negative. We found a few that were already dying, but no live ones. Same here. Every kobold we've seen is already dead. An incredulous huff left Bruffin as he exchanged a glance with Marcus. The implications were clear. If they were betting men, they'd put top dollar on this being an ambush on a kobold scavenging party. But it seemed as if these kobolds made their attackers pay a heavy price. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life again, the voice of the pilot in the circling Bell 206, cutting through. Brew, 206 here. We've got a scuffle in the backyard of the house you're in front of. Our snipers can't get a good shot on him. Over. Marcus immediately responded. Roger that, 206. We're on it. As Marcus put his radio away, Bruffin was already moving. He whistled sharply, catching the attention of 4 militia members who were clearing a nearby garage. They quickly finished their task before immediately disengaging and running over to assist with whatever needed to be done. With his impromptu team assembled, Bruffin led the way toward the house the 206 had indicated. They moved swiftly but cautiously, leapfrogging each other, always keeping someone on overwatch as they approached the side yard. However, the scene before them grew grimmer and grimmer with each step. The ground was littered with the bodies of scroungers and kobolds, a macabre trail of breadcrumbs leading to the ongoing scuffle. The sounds of the fight grew louder as they drew near. The snarls and hisses of the scroungers mingled with the distinctive yips and yaps of the kobolds, creating a discordant chorus. Beneath it, all was the constant clang and scrape of metal on metal as weapons clashed in a desperate struggle. One of the militia members, a veteran who was too old to get a recall, took point with Bergen and Marcus right close behind. As the team peered into the backyard, a gruesome scene unfolded before their eyes. 2 scroungers and 1 kobold lay dead on the ground, their bodies torn and bloodied from what must have been a vicious melee. But the fight wasn't over. A second kobold, wounded but alive, was straddling another scrounger, frantically stabbing at the creature with a spear that had been snapped in half. The kobold screamed with each thrust, a primal, desperate sound that spoke of pure survival instinct. The scrounger thrashed and howled, its claws raking at the kobold, but its struggles were growing weaker. Finally, with one last, gurgling stab, the scrounger went still. Bruffin and his team watched in stunned silence, their mouths agape. They had suspected they were in conflict since arriving at the scene, but to see their theories confirmed in real time was something else entirely. To see them fighting each other with such savagery was truly a sight to behold. However, their gawking was interrupted as the kobold fell back on its rear while clutching at its own wounds. Its breath came in ragged gasps and its small body shook from pain and exhaustion. But then, as if sensing it was being watched, the kobold turned its head. Its eyes widened in fear as it saw the group of heavily armed humans staring at it from across the yard. For a moment, no one moved. The kobold and the Minutemen stared at each other, unsure how to react to one another. Then, with a yelp of fear, the kobold shot to its feet and began limping away in a desperate bid to escape this new threat. Catch the little fucker! Bruffin shouted, already vaulting over the small chain-link fence meant to keep in a small dog. His men were right behind him, their gear clanking away as they vaulted over themselves to catch the little bastard. Nevertheless, the chase didn't last long, as the Bruffin caught up to the limping lizard in a matter of seconds. A panicked and pathetic yip left the kobold's mouth as Bruffin's much heavier body slammed into it, sending them both crashing into the ground. The kobold yipped and yapped in horror as it squirmed with all its might, desperately trying to escape Bruffin's grasp. It managed to wriggle free for a brief moment, its small, wiry frame slipping through Bruffin's hands, but its freedom was short-lived. Almost immediately, another Minuteman slammed into the kobold, sending it careening back to the ground. What followed was a chaotic flurry of kicks, punches, and rifle butts as the Minuteman tried to subdue the poor struggling creature. Getting back on his feet, Bruffin ran over to assist, barking orders as he did so. "Hold it down," he yelled as he pressed down on the creature's snout to prevent it from biting. "Don't let it get away." A whole slew of eyes from the house whose yard they were in were peering out behind curtains as the kobold continued to resist, curling into a tight ball to protect itself from the onslaught. Meanwhile, Bruffin scanned the backyard for something, anything that could help. His eyes then fell on a small sailboat that was falling apart, and without hesitation, he sprinted over to it. Reaching the boat, Bruffin quickly pulled out his knife and began sawing at the rigging with frantic urgency. In a matter of seconds, he had a length of cord in his hands. He raced back to the struggling group, the rope clutched tightly in his fist. "Tie the little shit up," he yelled, tossing the cord to his men. Catching the rope, the Minutemen immediately got to work in securing the kobold. Each person held a body part, pinning it down with their body weight as another began to tie it up like a Thanksgiving turkey. The process was tricky and was made all the more difficult by the kobold's continued resistance as it snapped and hissed. One of the Minutemen, a burly man with a thick beard, nearly lost a finger to those razor-sharp fangs as the kobold snapped pitch in a bite. Luckily, the man yanked his hand away just in time, but a tooth still snagged his hand, ripping open a fresh wound. "Watch it," Bruffin warned, seeing the close call. "Someone muzzle the fuck before it takes a chunk out of one of you." Not leaving it to chance, the Minutemen, who were basically sitting on the lizard's chest, started unwrapping the paracord on his knife handle. The man didn't waste any time in wrapping it around the kobold's snout and yanking tightly, making it impossible for the kobold to open its mouth. It was a makeshift muzzle, but it served its purpose well. With the kobold's mouth now forcibly shut and its limbs hog-tied, the poor thing could only emit muffled whimpers as the Minutemen finished their work. However, it made the creature finally safe to hand as Marcus hefted the trussed-up kobold over his shoulder with a grunt. The creature's small body dangled like a sack of potatoes as Marcus turned to Bruffin with a questioning look on his face. "What are we gonna do with this thing?" he asked, adjusting his grip on the squirming captive. A crease ran through Bruffin's forehead as he raised his eyebrow in thought and ran a hand through his hair. "I guess we're gonna hand it over to the police or something," he replied after a moment. "Maybe the little shit has some valuable intel they could exploit or something. I dunno. It just seemed like a good idea at the time." Silence reigned between the team before Marcus simply shrugged and adjusted himself, causing the kobold to bounce on his shoulder. "Hey, you're the boss," he said, his tone neutral. "If you think it's worth a shot, then why not?" Bruffin nodded, but there was a hint of uncertainty in his eyes. Truth be told, he wasn't entirely sure if this was the right move. It had been an impromptu decision made in the heat of the moment. But they were in uncharted territory here anyway, so just like Marcus said, why the hell not? Pushing his doubts aside, Bruffin beckoned to Marcus with his hand. "Gimme your radio for a minute," he said as Marcus reached for his belt and tossed the thing over in one fluid movement. "All teams, report status," Bruffin said after catching the radio and switch frequencies. And one by one, the teams checked in, each reporting their sector clear. No more scroungers, no more kobolds. It seemed the battle, at least for now, was over. Bruffin acknowledged each report with a satisfied nod before switching back to the channel with the circling bell. 206. 206, this is Brow. You see anything up there? Hold one. The pilot's voice came back calm and professional. And after a minute or two of silence, the report came back. Negative. Snipers are telling me that the area appears pretty much clear, over. Roger that, Bruffin said, a hint of relief in his voice. Maintain overwatch. We're preparing to get out of here. Over. Copy that, we'll keep an eye out. With that, Bruffin ended the transmission, but he pulled out his phone and began tapping away at the screen. A heavy sigh left his mouth as he navigated to his specific job in the Minuteman app and stared at the options momentarily. Looking around him and hearing no more sounds of gunfire, Bruffin gave one final tap on the big, bold letters that said complete job and hit the acknowledgement. Almost instantly after hitting the acknowledgement that he had indeed concluded his business in the area, his phone automatically dialed a number. An automated routing system then immediately connected his call to the joint state and federal emergency services that monitored the app. After a few rings, a feminine voice belonging to a dispatcher spoke up. "Mr. Bitterly," the woman said calmly and professionally. "This is Dispatcher Johnson. Can you confirm that your job is complete?" "Confirmed," Bruffin said in a tired but steady tone. "And we have a +1 package with potential intel. Where do you want us to drop it off?" There was a moment of silence as the sound of typing and hushed conversation echoed in the background. Then, the dispatcher spoke again. "Bring the package to the downtown precinct. They'll have a team ready to take custody." "Good work out there, Mr. Bitterly." "Yep, thanks," Bruffin grunted in acknowledgement, then ended the call. He looked around at his men, Marcus with the kobold still slung over his shoulder. "All right, boys," he announced as he stretched his back out. "Let's make like a book and get the fuck out of here." With his feet kicked up on the tailgate and a straw hat he had acquired covering his eyes, Elijah lounged in the back of the convoy, enjoying a well-deserved nap. The bumps and jolts from the ox-like creature pulling the cart were far from comfortable, but he'd like to think he found his slice of comfort. On his chest, Yana mirrored his position as her tiny head was propped up on his chin. The little fairy seemed to find his facial hair the perfect pillow, with her flickering fiery hair seemingly just gently rubbing against her apostle. Around them, the world was a tapestry of wonder and oddity. The landscape seemed to stretch out in every direction, with vast expanses of rolling hills and strange towering rock formations that seemed to bend and curl in odd directions. But the shapes weren't the only things interesting about the geology around them. Colors of almost every shade seemed to pop out at them in a way that said as if someone had turned up the saturation on reality itself. It all seemed too vivid to be real. The grass beneath the cart's wheels was a shade of green that seemed to pulsate with life. It was a color that no one in the ODA had seen before as it weaved with patches of flowers with petals shimmering in hues of purple, blue, and a yellow so bright it was almost impossible not to look at. In the distance, trees, unlike any on Earth, dotted the landscape. Some were massive, their trunks thicker than a dozen redwoods, with leaves that shimmered like polished silver. Others were tall and spindly, their branches twisting and curling in intricate patterns that seemed to defy what most knew about nature. And then there were the ones that looked like giant crystal formations, their translucent leaves tinkling softly in the breeze. "Yo, we're almost there." Bennett nudged Elijah with his boot, causing both the medic and his fairy to stir at the same time. Almost as if entirely in sync, Elijah and Yana mirrored the same stretch, pushing their arms over their heads while twisting their bodies. Yep, the medic groaned groggily as he slowly sat up. Sucking in a deep breath, Elijah once again noted that the air itself was different here. It was crisp and clean, with a faint hint of something sweet, like a mix of vanilla and cinnamon. Each breath felt invigorating, as if the very atmosphere was infused with a subtle energy that rejuvenated the body and calmed the mind. As a matter of fact, he couldn't help but notice a strange sensation spreading through his body. It was subtle, like a faint tingling that started at the tip of his skin and slowly crept inward, but it was there. Just barely. After years as a Special Forces soldier, Elijah had always had some stiffness or soreness from all the abuse he had put his body through. But now he felt some invisible weight had been lifted from his joints, like squeaky door hinges, getting a few sprays of WD-40. It wasn't a dramatic change, but rather a gentle shift, like a knot being loosened in a muscle he didn't even know was tense. With a shake of his head, Elijah dispelled the strange sensation creeping over him. As intriguing as it was, he knew he didn't have the luxury of dwelling on it now. There was a lot of work to be done and so little time. The mysteries of this new world and the sensations he was feeling were going to have to wait. A yawn left Yana's mouth as she fluttered around Elijah for a few moments, before settling on his shoulder. The little fairy rubbed her eyes, blinking in the warm light of the setting sun. As she peered around at the scene around here. "We should go around and try all their food." Bennett lazily looked off in the distance when he shifted his gaze to the little fairy. For a few moments, he stared at her intently, trying to gauge whether she was being ridiculous again or actually serious for once. Then, with a slow nod, he spoke. "I second that idea." His words were met with a sudden, giant yawn from the front of the cart. Azaleen, sitting in the cab, was in the middle of her own luxurious stretch. Her arms extended above her head as she leaned back far enough that her head was hanging upside down over the wall of the cab. From this inverted position, she looked at the boys, a playful grin on her face. Well, I know a few safe places where we can crash and get some food, she said, throwing one leg over the other and letting it bounce up and down. My tasker has an inn with one of the taverns, and their madam. Elijah raised an eyebrow, intrigued by this new information. Tasker? He asked, curiosity coloring his tone. Is that like a boss or something? I thought freelancers didn't have bosses. We don't. Azaleen laughed, the sound light and carefree, despite her upside-down position. At least, not a boss in the traditional sense, she clarified. Taskers are more like handlers, people who set up jobs, give us info, and take a cut of the profits. She then shifted to a little more comfortable position, slumping further into her seat. Taskers come in all kinds of flavors, but mine dabbles more on the illicit side of the fence. Azaleen continued. She's got connections all over, including in this town, and a madam of one of the taverns owes us, so we should be able to get a good deal on rooms and meals. As Azaleen discussed the details of their potential lodgings, Coleman, who had been walking alongside the cart, decided to chime in. He quickened his pace slightly to catch up to the others, his face etched with concern. Whoa, 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 he interjected in a low, but urgent voice. Let's not be so casual about this, all right? Elijah and Bennett turned to look at him, their expressions curious. Azaleen, still lounging in the cab, cocked her head to listen. I'm not saying we can't trust our local, but... Coleman continued looking to Azaleen, who narrowed her eyes at him. We're about to enter a town with a lot of unknowns. He looked to Azaleen, putting up placating hands. I'm not saying I don't trust you, but can we really trust anyone in this town? I mean, what do we actually know? And this madam, what's her deal? Is she just a tavern owner, or is there more to it? Azaleen sat up a little straighter and turned her body to meet Coleman's gaze. I see where you're coming from, she replied in an even tone. But you have to understand, in my line of work, trust is a relative thing. I trust people, including my tasker, as much as I can trust anyone in this business. They've never steered me wrong before. She shrugged, a small smile playing on her lips. As for the madam, well, let's just say her business extends beyond just running a tavern. But that's part of why she's so well connected. She hears things and knows things. She's a valuable resource. Coleman frowned, not entirely satisfied with this answer. How do we know she won't sell us out? If she's got her fingers in so many pies, who's to say one of those pies isn't working against us? Elijah, who had been listening intently, spoke up. Coleman, this is literally the point of going in with a local, he said as he moved to cover up any technology or weapons that may have been poking through. No matter what, we're going to be exposing ourselves. The medic's words seemed to strike a chord with Coleman, but the team leader still looked uncertain. He opened his mouth to respond, but Elijah continued before he could get a word in. Look, I get it, Elijah said, his tone understanding but firm. There are risks. Big ones. But that's part of the job, isn't it? We can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs. This isn't breakfast, Eli. Coleman frowned, his brow furrowing. I don't know about you, but I'm not particularly keen on being fried by Harry Potter or the Wicked Witch of the West, so we can't just go in half-cocked and hope for the best. A sigh left Elijah's mouth as his hand ran through his hair. I'm not saying we go in blind and know you don't like it. However, sometimes, you've just got to go with the flow and see where the current takes you. He explained his position as he turned toward the slowly approaching town. The potential payoff in intel, in subverting the local power structures, it's too big to pass up. Coleman's frustration was evident on his face. He looked to Bennett and Azaleen, hoping for some backup, but found only thoughtful expressions. They seemed to be considering Elijah's words, weighing the risks and rewards in their minds. I don't like it, he responded as he made a chopping motion with his hand to drive the point home. The unknowns, the potential for things to go sideways. That's not how I like to operate. Cole, this type of shit is the reality of our situation. We're in a new world, playing by new rules. We have to adapt and take some chances, or opportunities will slip by. He paused, letting his words sink in. Then Elijah looked to Azaleen and Bennett before speaking again. But if you're really not comfortable with it, if you think the risks outweigh the potential benefits, I can go in alone. I've done solo recce's by myself plenty of times. I can handle it. A hint of alarm flashed across Coleman's face as his eyes. What? No. He shook his head vehemently. There's no way in hell I'm sending anyone in alone, Eli. Especially not you. Elijah furrowed his brow and raised his hands in bewilderment. What the fuck is that supposed to mean? You know damn well what I mean, Coleman replied, pointing a knife hand at his medic. You're a damn good operator, one of the best. But you're also unpredictable. A wild card. Sending you in alone, with no backup, no oversight, it's a gamble I'm not willing to take. Irritation crept into Elijah's voice as he recoiled at the accusation. What the fuck? It's not like I'm going to go all murder hobo and start murking people like it's going out of fashion. That's not the point, Coleman countered, his tone growing more serious. I know you're not, but when you're on your own, you tend to improvise. To take risks, make judgment calls that might not always align with the mission parameters. He held up a hand, forestalling the argument he could see brewing in Elijah's eyes. I'm not saying it's always a bad thing. Your instincts and adaptability have gotten us much farther than I'd ever hoped, but in a situation like this, with so many unknowns, I need to know that everyone is on the same page, following the same playbook. And you tend to throw the playbook at the wall at your earliest convenience. Coleman finished, narrowing his eyes. A sour look flashed across Elijah's face as Coleman's words sank in. He leaned back, rolling his eyes in a display of frustration. As much as he hated to admit it, Coleman had a point. Elijah's methods could be unorthodox. His approach to problems was often unconventional. It was part of what made him effective, but it also made him a liability in the eyes of the U.S. Army. But that didn't mean he had to like it. Elijah knew that his team leader was a stickler for rules and procedures that minimized risk as the cost of effect. It was a modus operandi that stood directly opposite Elijah's own, trending towards mitigating risk, not avoiding it altogether. The risk was an omnipotent force that would always be an issue regardless of what one did. Still, he subscribed to the philosophy he had learned from the Marines whenever he worked with them: be aggressive enough, quickly enough, and push opportunities when they arose. However, after years of conflict with his command, Elijah finally learned when it was best just to shut up and take a back seat. To his chagrin, the medic wasn't about to voice these thoughts to Coleman. Not now, not when they were just about to enter a town with its myriad of potential threats and opportunities, and especially not when the team leader was antsy. The last thing he needed was another incident on the field, where he got kicked out altogether. So, instead, Elijah bit his tongue. He swallowed his objections and nodded. All right, fine, he replied in a carefully neutral tone. A solo recce is out of the question. What do you suggest other than trusting our local? Coleman took a deep breath, his brow furrowed in thought. He turned to Azaleen, who had been quietly observing the exchange. All right, Azaleen, he said, his tone serious, but not unkind. You're our local expert here. What can you tell us about the town's layout and the key players we need to be aware of? Azaleen let out an exasperated sigh as she started to tie her long, blonde hair into a bun. Guys, I already told you the layout of the town and most of what I know about it in general, she said, her tone a mix of patience and mild annoyance. Nevertheless, she repeated the information for the benefit of the group. The town is divided into several districts. The central district is where most of the trade and commerce happens, and where you'll find the more upscale establishments, including the tavern my tasker has connections with. The outer districts are more residential, but they're also where you'll find the seedier elements, thieves' dens, black markets, that sort of thing. She paused, making sure everyone was following before continuing. Now, as for who's in control, officially, it's the Empire. They have a presence here, but it's not as heavy as in some of the larger cities. Glensworth is far enough away from Alden Shore that it's become a sort of mini-capital for smugglers. The Shield Maiden waved her hand nonchalantly and spoke as if this was common knowledge. The real power in Glensworth lies with the various underground gangs and organizations. They use the town as a staging area for smuggling operations, taking advantage of its location on the Idles River. I don't really have anything more than that, honestly. She shrugged as a hint of an apology echoed in her voice. I haven't spent much time in Glensworth myself. Smuggling isn't really my thing, I'm more the muscle, the enforcer type. But this is what I've gathered from my tasker and other freelancers that did jobs there. Coleman rubbed his face, grumbling under his breath as he tried to process this information and formulate a plan. The situation was more complex than he had initially thought, with multiple factions to consider and a delicate power balance to navigate. After a moment, he spoke. Okay, here's what we'll do. We'll split into 2 cells. The first group will enter the town and secure lodging at the tavern Azaleen mentioned. They'll start making nice with the locals and gathering intel. The second group will come in next, posing as merchants. They'll stage near the gates if we need to make a quick exfil. But before he could continue, Elijah interjected. Why don't we make it 3 cells, he suggested, his tone thoughtful. 2 teams of 3, 1 team of 6, the medic stopped mid-sentence, realizing they were short 1 man. Well, 5, since Silva is all messed up. His hand waved dismissively as he continued to put out his plan. The first team makes entry and secures the tavern. The second team comes in as merchants and try to source secondary lodging. And the third team acts as a quick reaction force and posture if anything goes to shit? Elijah lazily turned to Coleman and saw he was warming up to the idea. We decentralize our operations. That way, I get what I want, and if one team gets compromised, the others can still function. We don't all go down in one fell swoop. Coleman opened his mouth, ready to dismiss Elijah's proposal outright out of habit. But he paused, his mouth still open, as the gears in his mind started to turn. A few moments of silence passed as he sucked in a deep breath, his forehead creasing as he furrowed his brows in contemplation. As much as he hated to admit it, it was a sound plan. Despite Elijah's somewhat unhinged nature, the man was a damn good strategist. His tactical mind was sharp, always looking for angles and contingencies. Finally, Coleman spoke in a reluctant but approving tone. All right, we'll go with 3 cells. He said, looking around at the group. Here's how we'll divide it up. Bennett, Elijah, and I will be part of Team 1. Quan takes Team 2. Lister will be in charge of the QRF. He then looked at Azaleen and gave her a complicated look. The elf woman seemed to mesh well with Elijah, and in Coleman's opinion, that was somewhat problematic. Azaleen, are you willing to stay with the caravan? It might go a long way to. No, Azaleen cut off the human in a flat, deadpan tone. A bout of silence lingered between the two before she jerked her thumb toward Elijah. I'm going with him, she said definitively. Elijah couldn't help but huff in amusement at Azaleen's response. The sound caused Coleman to shoot him an icy glare, and in return, the medic threw up his arms and made a face that said he didn't do anything and remained silent. Turning attention back to Azaleen Coleman, she looked to argue further, but the woman shot him with her own glare as her lip curled up into a snarl. Realizing it was best to let sleeping dogs lie and take what he could get, he shook his head and relented. All right, he said with a sigh. Azaleen's with Team 1, then. Okay then, Coleman grumbled before turning towards the Australians' vehicles and operators who were escorting them. I guess I'll go and see if our Aussie friends are interested in helping us enter the town. We're gonna need more bodies if shit goes south. He finished before turning around and walking towards the SASR LRPDs. As the sun dipped halfway over the horizon, it cast a warm and gentle glow over the landscape as it threatened to disappear quickly. Shadows seemed to extend endlessly while sensationally colored lights danced along the ground as Azaleen, Elijah, Coleman, and Bennett made their way toward the gates of Glensworth as an advanced party. There was a strange beauty to this that seemed to capture the adventurers. It wasn't the familiar oranges and reds they were used to in their world, but this world also included a mesmerizing dance of blues, purples, and greens from the crystal-like plants and the weird bioluminescence dotting the landscape. The colors shifted and swirled like a mirage, creating an almost psychedelic display. Taken from that freelancer Azaleen had ended, Elijah rested a two-handed axe leisurely over his shoulder as he followed his local expert as she strode toward the gate with a self-assured gait. Hey, Yana, Elijah suddenly called out as he looked over at his shoulder to see a fairy, her legs carelessly as she sat on his shoulder. If you hide from me, I'll let you watch more stuff when we settle down. K. Yana seemed to chirp happily at the prospect of watching more of those strange plays on her mortal strange devices. She then hopped up on her feet and jumped into his hood without using her wings before yanking on a fistful of his hair. I expect my standard tribute when you're done doing whatever it is your mortals do. A sigh left Elijah's mouth as he turned his attention away from his patron and back towards his Azaleen, who was leading the way. Just ahead, he saw a small group of guards lounging lazily by the gate. The men were doing the absolute minimum as they inspected each cart and questioned each individual who attempted to enter the town. The guards' postures remained relaxed, and their expressions bored. It was as if they seemed just about fed up with the day, eager for their shift to end and the night to begin. Almost as if sensing his gaze, Azaleen turned her head around and smiled coyly at him. "Let me do all the talking." Coleman and Bennett were hot on their heels, with spears taken from the caravan gripped in their hands. They had opted for more traditional weapons to blend in better with the local populace. "You sure that's a good play?" Coleman voiced his concern as he stared at Azaleen hard with a somewhat worried look. Elijah turned to look at his team leader. "The local is gonna know how to deal with other locals," he said somewhat incredulously. "Just let her do her thing." He knew Coleman was extremely nervous about this entry, and he also knew the man was somewhat of a control freak, especially when there were so many unknown variables. But trying to micromanage a situation he had almost zero experience in or, hell, a frame of reference in was the surest way to get them all made. A sour look formed on Coleman's face as he shot a glare toward his subordinate but remained silent. As much as he didn't like it, Coleman knew that Elijah was right. He had just to let go and place his fate in the hands of this elf and hope for the best. Any interference with any local interaction could have a disastrous effect, and he wasn't stupid enough to screw it all up just because he was nervous. Seeing him settle down, Elijah tightened his grip on his axe. Despite how casually he had waved off and dismissed Coleman's worries, he shared them as well. He, too, didn't particularly like how little control he had over the situation, but he was also far more experienced in dealing with these types of scenarios. As they drew closer to the gate, Elijah allowed Azaleen to take the lead. His mind instead turned to the razor-sharp axe in his hands in order to take his mind off his own anxiety. The weapon was almost perfectly balanced, and in his opinion, as deadly as any firearm in the hands of any of these punch wizards. A huff of amusement escaped Elijah's mouth as his mind went to the new moniker he came up with for these magic-using warriors. Punch wizards. He breathed out humorously. Just when Azaleen approached the guards, she waved at them with a friend and disarming smile. "Evening, gentlemen," she called out in a light and airy tone. "Long day of doing nothing?" One of the guards, a shorter human male with a scarred face, looked up in irritation when he heard Azaleen's voice. His eyes narrowed as recognition dawned, and a snarl twisted across his features. Well, he drawled lazily as he looked at Elijah and the rest of the squad behind him. "If it ain't the elf bitch herself." Azaleen's smile never wavered, and as a matter of fact, it seemed to beam brighter at the sound of agitation in the guard's voice. "Nice to see you too, Garrick," she replied, a repulsively fluffy tone. "I see your manners haven't improved since last we met." Garrick spat on the ground as his sneer deepened. "Feck yourself," he growled, the words dripping with venom. "What brings your knife-eared ass back to Glensworth? Thought you'd go do your damn job and fecked off. Your boss know you're still millin' about?" But even as he spoke, the guard was walking towards them, his hand outstretched in a beckoning motion. "Come on, then," he said impatiently. "Hurry up and quit wasting my time. Ye know the drill." The sound of laughter rang out in the evening air as Azaleen held her head with one hand and used the other to dig into her pocket in order to pull out a single silver coin, holding it up between two fingers. "Don't worry about it, you filthy drag. This should cover us, right?" she asked, her eyebrow arched. "I don't want to hear no bullshit from you or your boys." After seeing how easy it was to get the bribe out of the usually stingy woman, a glint of greed sparked in Garrick's eye as he stared at the sparkling coin. He quickly approached Azaleen and reached out to grab it but suddenly stopped halfway through as a thought crossed his mind. His gaze then drifted to her companions behind her, and she realized they weren't the same people. "These ain't the folks you left with," he said accusingly in an almost enthusiastic tone. "You picking up strays now? There's been talk of bandits and invaders round these parts." He sneered, sensing an opportunity. Coleman tensed as his hand tightened on his spear. The accusation and implied threat of the guard's tone caused his anxiety to spike as his other hand drifted to his hidden rifle. But before he could think to do anything, he felt Elijah's hand squeeze his arm firmly, but gently. "Relax, this is just posturing," Elijah calmly whispered next to Coleman. "He's just being a greedy bitch, trying to squeeze a little more money out of her." Azaleen, meanwhile, was unfazed and shrugged carelessly. "I said don't worry about it. This also means to ignore my new crew," she said simply. "You know how it is in our line of work." Garrick's eyes narrowed further as his calculating gaze swept across each face. I suppose I do," he said slowly. But that don't explain why I should let 'em in. 1 silver for you, sure. But these louts? They look like they might be trouble. The guard licked his lips hungrily. Suddenly, Azaline's posture shifted from casual to confrontational in a heartbeat as her eyes narrowed at the greedy son of a bitch. 1 silver per person, she repeated, her voice dripping with scorn. Are you out of your fucking mind, Garrick? The guard scoffed, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He knew he was treading on dangerous ground, but his lust for coin was getting the better of him. Times are tough, elf, he said, trying to sound conciliatory. There be a war, and the Empire is bein' all uppity. Gotta make a living somehow, and your friends here look like they can afford it. Azaline shook her head in disbelief at the sheer gall of the man trying to take advantage of her even though she knew who she worked for. You're a feckless idiot if you think I'm stupid enough to pay more than a single silver for everyone here. She snarled, taking a step forward into Garrick's personal space. 1 coin covers the whole party, in and out, whenever we damn well please. That's the deal, and you fucking know it. To his credit, Garrick held his ground in the face of someone as intimidating as Azaline, but Elijah could see the sweat starting to bead on his brow. Now, he said, his tone wheedling. Let's not be hasty. These are dangerous times, what with all the new faces coming through. Can't be too careful. Surely an extra coin or two, for the sake of security. But Azaline was having none of it. Her hand went to the hilt of her sword as her eyes blazed with fury. Listen to me, you greedy sack of shit, she hissed, her voice low and deadly. I've had just about enough of your games. 1 silver, for all of us. That's the end of it. Push me on this, and I swear by all the gods, I will run you through and leave your corpse for the rotwings. Azaline growled, pulling her sword out. The feck you say to me, whore. Garrick shouted in anger as he snapped his finger, causing the other guards to surround Azaline and her group in a semicircle. Ye fecked up, elf. Ain't no one gonna know ye gonna when you ain't here on business. The tension in the air became palpable as Coleman watched the situation spiral out of control. The movement of the other guards screamed danger as his hidden rifle inched closer to the opening of his cloak. His body was coiled, ready to spring into action at the slightest sign of violence. But just as Coleman was about to make his move, Elijah's voice cut through the tension. Chill, dude, he said, his tone casual but firm. They're not gonna do anything. This is all just a show. Coleman glanced at Elijah, his brow furrowed in confusion. But the medic just grinned, nodding towards Garrick and his men. The fucker's peacocking, he explained, keeping his voice low. Trying to see what he can get away with. But he's not gonna push it. Even as Elijah spoke, however, the guards were getting shifty. They pointed their polearms at Azaline and postured and poised themselves aggressively, ready to attack. A smug smile floated across Garrick's face as took a few steps back, clearly enjoying the show. Take her down on me, Mark, boys, he ordered, his voice dripping with anticipation. Let's show this elf bitch what happens when you don't pay the toll. But Azaline just laughed, the sound cold and mocking. She looked around at the guards, her eyes glinting with a dangerous light. You think you and your little band of losers intimidate me? She asked in an unbelieving and incredulous tone. Garrick, you know who I am. You know what I'm capable of. There was a moment of tense silence as Garrick and Azaline stared each other down. The guards, for all their bravado, seemed to be having second thoughts. They knew Azaline's reputation and knew that she was not someone to be trifled with. As Garrick and Azaline squared off, the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The guards, despite their aggressive posturing, were looking increasingly nervous. All of them were well aware that she was a trained mana user and had seen her handle individuals they couldn't even hope to scratch. Yet they surrounded Azaline with their weapons drawn, pointed directly at her. It was clear they were doing this more out of a sense of duty to Garrick than any real belief that they could win. Azaline, for her part, seemed utterly unconcerned. She smiled mockingly and condescendingly at Garrick while twirling her sword playfully in one hand. Her strange shield was pointed directly at the guard lieutenant, a clear challenge. Garrick met her gaze as his eyes bore into hers with a fierce glare. But despite his steely expression, there were cracks in his facade. The guard leader's hands fidgeted nervously at his sides, and a bead of sweat trickled down his temple. The standoff seemed to stretch on for an eternity, the air crackling with tension. But in the end, it was Garrick who broke first. With a growl of frustration, he kicked at the dirt as his face twisted in a scowl. Fine, he spat, holding out his hand. Gimme the damn silver coin, ye damned whore. It ain't worth dying over. Azaline's smile widened, taking on a truly mocking edge. She sheathed her sword with a flourish, giggling as she did so before tossing him the singular silver coin. Smart for someone so stupid, she replied, her voice dripping with condescension. Garrick glared at her, his eyes burning with humiliation and rage. But he said nothing as he snatched the silver coin from Azaline's hand, waving her and the others through the gate with a curt gesture. But as they started to move forward, Azaline paused. She reached into her pouch and pulled out 5 more silver coins, the ones Elijah had given her from the stash they'd found in the ruined village. Here, she said, dropping them to the ground and kicking them toward Garrick in a mocking fashion. There's a caravan of villagers from Twineward coming through later. Don't inspect them, just let them pass. The already angry guard leader became even more furious as he opened his mouth, but Azaline cut him off before he could speak. She cooed in a patronizing fashion. If I hear you were any trouble for anyone in that caravan, she said, her tone light but with an undercurrent of steel. You'll be making trouble for Indy. The mention of Indy's name sent a visible shockwave through the gathered guards. Even Garrick, for all his bluster and bravado, couldn't hide the flash of fear that crossed his face as he took a few steps back. At least Tomos had told him that this damned elf had concluded her job Indy had tasked her. But Garrick knew that bastard was dumb as bricks and was wrong a lot more often than he was even halfway correct. The usual facade Garrick wore started to crack, revealing the terror beneath. Indy's name always evoked a mix of awe and dread. The mysterious figure was known to have their fingers in every pie, from the humblest beggar to the richest of merchants. Those who crossed them had a habit of disappearing, only to turn up later in the Idol's River, a stone tied to their feet. It didn't matter who you were, a lowly guardsman or even the mayor. If you interfered with Indy's business, you were signing your own death warrant. Not so long ago, there had been a time when the town had gone through several mayors in quick succession. Each thought of themselves above Indy's influence, and each tried to assert their own authority. And each had met a grisly end, their bodies washing up on the riverbank, bloated and fish-eaten. Since then, a simple understanding has been reached. Don't poke your nose into Indy's business. Everyone knew Azaline often worked for Indy, and with just a few words, the elf had invoked her boss' authority and placed the coming caravan under Indy's protection. She made it clear that any interference would be seen as a direct challenge to her boss. Garrick looked like he might be sick as his face went pale. His hands trembled as he quickly bent over to pick up the silver coins. He knew, with a sinking certainty, that he had no choice but to comply. You understood, he stammered, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. The caravan will pass through unmolested. Ye have my word. Azaline's smile was like a razor's edge. Good, she purred. See that it does. Indy doesn't take kindly to disappointment. With that, Azaline waved for the others to follow her as she strode into the city. Elijah and the rest fell into step behind her, leaving the guards chirping nervously at each other, as if they had just narrowly avoided a brush with death. As they passed through the gate, Coleman quickened his pace to walk alongside Azaline. That was impressive. He commented, his tone a mix of admiration and curiosity. But why didn't you drop Indy's name earlier? Could have saved us a lot of trouble. Azaline glanced at him, a knowing smile playing on her lips. Garrick's the kind of man who only responds to a firm hand, she explained. If I had played that card too early, he might have thought he could still push his luck, maybe try to squeeze a little more out of us. She shook her head, her expression turning serious. No, with bullies like him, you need to put them in their place first. Show them that you're not to be trifled with. Then, and only then, do you use a higher authority. Elijah, who had been listening in, chimed in. You give a guy like that an inch, he'll try to take a mile. You've got to shut that down hard and fast, or he'll start thinking he can poke his nose where it doesn't belong. He grinned, a mischievous glint in his eye. A quick kick in the nuts, a little humiliation, it reminds him who's really in charge. After that, he'll do what he's told, no questions asked. Coleman looked at the two of them as a flicker of suspicion crept across his gaze. He had already put together that Azaline worked for the more underground elements of this world, but Elijah seemed to be equally as knowledgeable. It made him wonder just how much experience the medic had with these kinds of situations and where he learned it from. But before he could dwell on it further, Coleman realized they had just fully entered the town, and the sights and sounds of Glensworth drove all other thoughts from his mind. It was a place that buzzed with an energy that was at once alien and familiar. In many ways, it resembled the medieval towns Coleman had seen in movies or shows: narrow, winding streets lined with stone buildings, the clang of blacksmiths' hammers ringing out from open-air forges, the cries of street vendors hawking their wares. But there were also elements that were distinctly fantastical. Vegetation seemed to grow from every crack and crevice: vines, mushrooms, and strange, luminescent flowers sprouting from the very stones of the streets and winding along walls. Children and diminutive creatures darted through the crowds, baskets strapped to their backs, plucking the growths and tossing them into their containers as they went about. And then there were the people themselves. Humans mingled with a smorgasbord of beings that ranged from the elves to the outright bizarre. Coleman saw a towering figure that looked like it was a damned minotaur, except the man had tanned skin and goat horns. Then, there was a slender being that was similar to the elves, except their skin was like obsidian, and then a short creature that seemed to be somewhat similar to the mythical satyrs walked by. But, instead of the standard males that were standard in mythology, these were a mix of males and females. Shaking his head, Coleman reached into his cloak and discreetly clicked his radio to life. "This is Baron 1 to all entry elements," he said, his voice low but clear. "We've secured entry into the town for the caravan. Integrate with them and proceed as planned." "Over." Bennett let out a low whistle as they made their way through the somewhat crowded streets of Glensworth. "It's like one of your shitty animes, Eli," he said, with eyes wide with wonder. "Try not to fuck anything, okay?" "Eat my ass, Ben," Elijah replied distractedly as his eyes followed one of the satyr-like beings that had the lower half resembling a bipedal goat with short but shaggy fur and cloven hooves. But besides the hooves and fur, she was all woman, with smooth, ashen skin and a mane of wild, wavy hair that framed her face like a lion's. The satyr-like woman wore a simple tunic that left her breasts and midriff bare, and around her neck hung a variety of charms and talismans, each one glinting in the sunlight as she moved. But it wasn't her exotic and alluring features that caught Elijah's attention. It was her beautiful face. With high cheekbones, full lips, and eyes that seemed to sparkle with mischief. As she passed by, the satyr-like woman turned to the medic and smiled brightly before giving him a wink. Elijah couldn't help but gawk as he stared at her hips, which swayed with a provocative grace. When his eyes finally floated up, Elijah noticed the small horns protruding from the front of her head. They curled aggressively back into her hair, giving her an air of untamed wildness that said she'd ram you if trifled with. But just as Elijah found himself captivated by the alluring satyr-like woman, she suddenly came to a stop on the other side of the road. Turning to face him fully, she flashed a seductive smile, her eyes locking with his in an inviting gaze. For a moment, Elijah's other head started thinking for him while his mind raced with the possibilities after seeing those horns. He kept walking with the group, but goddamn was drawn to her like a moth to a flame. But before his perverted thoughts could take another turn, he felt a sharp yank on his arm. Yelping in surprise, Elijah stumbled forward, nearly losing his balance. "Oh no, you don't," Azaleen said, her grip on his arm firm as she dragged him along. "Leave the Inaris alone." Elijah regained his footing, shooting Azaleen a look of annoyed confusion. "Yo, what the fuck?" Bennett rubbed his scraggly beard as he furrowed his brow. "Inaris? Is that what they're called?" Azaleen nodded at the engineer, not slowing her pace as she dragged Elijah along. "Yes, and you're not getting involved with one," she scolded as she turned back to Elijah, who seemed to struggle under the woman's strength. "We need to get to the tavern. You can find working girls there if you're that desperate." She then shot him a warning look. "Knowing your luck, you'll end up with some cultist that mind-fucks you into self-sacrifice. Next thing you know, you'll be ripping out your own intestines so they can eat them." Coleman, who had been listening to the exchange, blanched. "Jesus, what the hell," he exclaimed, his eyes wide with horror. "Are you being hyperbolic?" A grim expression spread across Azaleen's face as she shook her head. "I wish I were, but there are factions of radical extremists from certain druidic sects that practice forbidden magic," she said, with a twitching eye. "They're cannibals, and they use sex as a lure." She continued, her voice low and serious. "They keep their victims locked away, using carnal pleasures as part of a ritual spell. It slowly infects the mind with a parasite, driving the person mad. The elf's eyes then took on a haunted look as she spoke. And then, in the middle of the orgy, once the spell is complete, the victim uses their bare hands to tear open their own belly. They rip out their intestines, offering them up to the cultists to feast upon. Elijah, who had been struggling against Azaline's grip, suddenly went still. His face paled, and he looked like he might be sick. "Jesus fucking Christ," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "How do you even know this? This has to be some kind of horror story you tell kids or some shit." "It's really not." Azaline shuddered as she dug into her memory. "I've had jobs where I've encountered the aftermath of such rituals and even interrupted a few." Bennett, too, looked shaken. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. "Okay then," he said, his usual bravado absent from his voice. "Sadder things are evil cultists." "Got it." Azaline sighed, shaking her head. "No, not all of them. Very few Inaris are actually cultists. Most are just decent folk, but they can be a bit enthusiastic when it comes to carnal matters." She paused, considering her next words. "But think of it this way. If you had 100 steamed buns, but one of them would kill you if you ate it, would you take the risk?" Finally regaining his footing, Elijah shot Azaline a dirty look as he straightened himself out with a harumph. Despite the grim warnings, he couldn't resist glancing back at the alluring Inaris. As if sensing his gaze, the satyr-like woman turned, waved at Elijah, and then walked off and disappeared into the crowd with a sway of her hips. Turning back to Azaline, Elijah gave a nonchalant shrug. "Well, I'm not much of a gambler," he admitted. But then, a mischievous grin spread across his face. "But I'd like to consider myself a risk-taker." A scoff left Azael's mouth as she rolled her eyes in exasperation. "Of course you do," she muttered, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Why am I not surprised?" Before Elijah could retort with another insufferable comment, Coleman interjected, his voice firm and authoritative. "No," he said, his gaze fixed on Elijah. "We have things to do and places to be. We don't have time for your dick to lead you into some goddamn cannibalistic cult." He then pushed Elijah forward with a rather hard shove, causing him to stumble once more. "We have a goddamn tavern to scope out." Okay. Jesus." Elijah grumbled as he finally started cooperating and followed after Azaline under his own power. "I was just joking, God." "No, you weren't." Bennett narrowed his eyes and immediately called out the medic's bullshit. "Everyone here is well aware of the fact you weren't kidding." Azaline sighed as she placed a hand over her face to hide the exasperated expression that was starting to form. "Just follow me," she said with a sigh, making it clear just how ridiculous she found this lecherous man's behavior. As she led the way through the winding streets of Glensworth, the group couldn't help but marvel at the sights and sounds surrounding them. Every stall, every build, and every shop they passed was just as fascinating as the last. Apothecaries with windows full of strange reagents ranging from dried-out animal parts to oddly glowing stones, shelves lined with jars, and vials of every color and size. Weapon shops displayed an array of arms, from the mundane pointy spear to exotic curved blades that gleamed with an otherworldly pulse. But what really caught their eye was a rather expensive-looking building, its facade adorned with intricate carvings and glowing symbols. Instead of windows, the shop had strange shimmers that acted as windows into the interior. Through this arcane barrier, they caught glimpses of shelves lined with all manner of weird and wonderful artifacts. Crystal orbs swirled with multicolored mists, ancient tomes bound in leather and embossed with glowing runes and ornate staves topped with gems that pulsed with an inner light. It was a veritable treasure trove of magical curiosities, each item more intriguing than the last. A relatively thin, petite man with long, flowing, ashen hair emerged from the shop as they watched. His ears, as long as his forearm, drooped slightly, giving him an almost ethereal appearance. With a graceful wave of his hands, the shimmering windows winked out of existence, leaving only solid wooden walls in their place. Despite his earlier preoccupation with the sultry Inaris, Elijah couldn't help but gawk at the display of magic. "You gotta admit," he said, pointing at the long-eared shopkeeper, "that was pretty damn cool." Bennett, equally slack-jawed, nodded in agreement. "Yeah, this is some crazy Final Fantasy shit," he muttered, his eyes wide with wonder. Even Coleman, who had been tense and anxious about being surrounded by potential hostiles, couldn't help but look around wide-eyed at the fantastical displays surrounding them. The wonders of this new world, it seemed, were capable of breaking through even his professionalism. Azaleen, on the other hand, seemed completely unfazed. To her, this was just everyday life. Throwing her head over her shoulder, Azaleen gave the boys an incredulous look as a crooked smile played on her lips. It was as if they were country bumpkins visiting a town for the first time. It became very evident that she would have to teach them a thing or two before they fully entered the lion's den. But it wasn't long before the well-maintained streets and bustling merchant stalls gave way to a rougher, dirtier environment. There were no guards or shopkeepers, just distinctly mercenary-looking individuals with hardened faces and rough-spun clothes. When Azaleen finally found herself standing in front of their destination, she glanced around at the building surrounding it. The tavern looked out of place in comparison to everything else around it. The building was far larger than any other inn or tavern they had passed on their way there, and it seemed to serve far more functions than any similar establishment. Gone were the plainly clothed commoners and townsfolk that had populated the main streets. In their stead was a litany of rough-looking and armed freelancers, huddled in their own groups, chatting away or milling about. But once Azaleen and her group made their way towards the tavern's entrance, these mercenary types gave them sidelong glances and appraising looks as they approached. They were already familiar with and wary of Azaleen, but her new group was obviously being sized up. Azaleen, however, ignored these looks entirely. Instead, she glared at anyone stupid enough to stare too long and marched toward the entrance. But once she approached the door, she stopped and spun on her heels to face her group. "All right, listen up," she said in a low voice. "We need to go over some ground rules before you waltz on in there." She threw a thumb over her shoulder towards the tavern. "This place isn't just a watering hole or a place where you can get your dick wet. It's a hub or a general gathering place for taskers and freelancers. It's where you go to find work, make contacts, and get information." Her expression turned serious. "There's a lot of ego and attitude in there. But most importantly, one of my best friends owns this place, the sister tavern to the one in Alden Shore." Azaleen narrowed her eyes as she looked over the humans. "I don't want any shit being stirred here, so here are the rules." She held up a finger. "First, don't go off talking to random people. Most of the time, they're not going to be friendly. They're here to do business, not make friends." Another finger went up. "Second, if someone does approach you, be polite but firm. Don't promise anything, and don't agree to anything until you've had a chance to talk it over with me." A third finger. "And third, keep your eyes and ears open, but your mouth shut. Anything you say is going to be used against you by some two-bit tasker looking to cut his teeth or scam you." She looked at each of them in turn, her gaze intense. "You're strangers here. That makes you interesting, but it also makes you targets. So be smart, be cautious, and don't cause any trouble." "Eli." She looked at Elijah, who seemed to be offended by the accusation. The man pointed at himself with both hands and mouthed words, "What the fuck?" Azaleen then fixed the group with a more accommodating gaze. "I know you guys aren't soft," she said, her tone acknowledging their competence. "And you're definitely not new to conflict. But you are new to this land, and that will be obvious to everyone in there." She paused, making sure her words were sinking in. "Do you all understand?" The group nodded, murmuring their assent. Coleman and Bennett's expressions were serious, their postures alert. Elijah, however, rolled his eyes and muttered his acknowledgement as his attention drifted off to the exotic faces and points of interest around him. It seemed this side of town differed notably from the more affluent areas they had passed through earlier. The buildings here were predominantly wooden, with less stone construction than they had seen before. Some structures even looked hastily repaired, bearing the scorch marks of past fires. Luckily, the tavern seemed much better maintained and built, its structure more solid and intact than its neighbors. As Elijah's gaze wandered, it fell upon a striking pair of individuals who seemed to be amid an argument. One was a hulking figure, standing at least 7 feet tall, with long and pointed ears, while also bearing a deep, ashen-gray skin tone that was marred with scars. 2 large ram-like horns protruded from his forehead, giving him a fearsome, almost bestial appearance. His opponent, in contrast, was a lot more human-looking but stood just a little 4 feet tall, bearing his wild hair, which seemed to point in every direction. Despite his short stature, he was extraordinarily wide and stocky for someone his height, and even from under his massive beard, you could tell his frame was packed with dense muscle. but that was equally true for the ram-horned man. Both of them had equally impressive physiques, and they gestured wildly, pointing at a scantily clad human woman who looked at them sultrily. "What the fuck?" Elijah muttered, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Is that a—" But before he could finish his thought, he felt a light weight settle on his head. Yana, who had been quietly observing until now, interjected flippantly. "I think that's a Tauri and a dwarf or something," she said, her tiny voice filled with bored nonchalance. "I don't really remember what you mortals call yourselves, but that's not important." Her tone took on an annoying, insistent tone as she yanked at Elijah's hair. "What's important is the fact that I smell food in there. I must try it. I demand it." Elijah sighed, reaching up to flick the head of the fairy harassing him. Yeah, we'll get you something to munch on, fatty," he replied in a tone full of exasperation. "But stay hidden for now. These freaks might lose their minds when they see you, and I don't want to deal with it." "Ka," his patron replied just as the door to the taverns opened, but just as soon as Yana had the flippant agreement she had made with her apostol, she had forgotten. Almost immediately, she buzzed out of Elijah's hood the moment she heard the sounds of clanking mugs and the roar of laughter. All around was the noise of jubilation and merriment, and the little fairy seemed to be intoxicated by it as she flew around erratically. A flash of panic spread across Elijah's face as he opened his mouth to yell for the little goddess to come back, but he immediately shut it the moment he saw that no one else seemed to notice the little menace. Shaking his head, the medic jogged forward to catch up with the group, his head swiveling as he tried to keep track of Yana as she seemed to be doing something. Oblivious to Elijah's worries, Bennett seemed to just be gawking at everyone and everything he saw, while in contrast, Coleman had a nervous, straight-edged look on his face. The team leader's posture was ramrod straight, and his eyes darted about as if expecting trouble at any moment. Azaleen, on the other hand, seemed utterly bored by the proceedings as she walked through the crowd, shoulder-checking and nearly shoving anyone stupid enough to linger in the way. As they wove their way through the chaotic press of bodies, Elijah shook his head, decided whatever would be, and took in the scene around him as well. As his eyes wandered, he found that there were humans and elves with ears just like Azaleen's, adding a small layer of elegance. Dwarves clustered around low tables, their booming laughter rising above the din, while more of the Tauri loomed at the room's edges, doing their best to eat with the alien utensils in their hands. But then, Elijah's roving gaze fell upon a sight that made his heart skip a beat. There, perched on a raised stool at the bar, was a dark-haired woman unlike any he had ever seen. She was slender and tanned, her body clad in a plain dress that did little to hide her curvaceous form. But what really caught Elijah's attention were the two furry, feline ears that poked up from her black hair and the long, sinuous tail that whipped back and forth behind her. Bro. Elijah hissed excitedly, elbowing Bennett repeatedly in the ribs. "Check it out." He jutted his finger out at the cat-eared woman, his eyes going wide, and a grin split his face. Following his gaze, Bennett's own jaw went slack as he took in the sight. The woman was clearly a working girl, one of the many courtesans in this establishment. She was perched on her stool in a way that showcased her incredible flexibility. One leg was raised high and hugged at her chest, while the other stretched out on top of the bar next to her. It was a pose that was both alluring and anatomically impressive and highlighted the supple skin of her leg. As they watched, a patron approached the cat girl with a sparkling coin twisting in his hand. The elven man's hand shouted out and began to wander over the feline's body in a possessive and transactional way as he placed the bronze coins on the table. The woman leaned into his touch, a sultry look on her face, but her eyes were fixed on the coins the man had pulled from his purse. Bennett's eyes widened as he took in the sight of the cat-eared woman. "Oh no," he muttered under his breath, a sense of dread crept into his voice. Quickly, he reached out and grabbed Coleman's shoulder, shaking him urgently. "Cole," he hissed, his voice rising in pitch. "Eli found a cat girl." Both Azaleen and Coleman whipped around at Bennett's words, their gazes immediately seeking out Elijah. And there he was, a predatory smile playing at his lips as he licked his fingertips and then smoothed them over his eyebrows in a comical and unsettling gesture. With a swagger in his step, Elijah started to saunter towards the bar with his eyes locked on the feline courtesan. But before he could even take a second complete step, both Azaleen and Coleman lunged forward, each grabbing one of his arms in a vice-like grip. "Nope," Coleman barked in a stern and unyielding voice. "Not today, dipshit." "Ah, come on, guys," Elijah whined as he stumbled back in the direction the group was headed. "I was just gonna say hello." Maybe offer to buy her a drink. Despite Elijah's half-hearted protests, Azaleen and Coleman weren't about to let him wander off. They kept a firm grip on his arms as they dragged him along. "Come on, you idiot," Azaleen grumbled, rolling her eyes in exasperation. "You can get service after we've taken care of business." A dramatic sight left Elijah's mouth as he allowed himself to be led, knowing that he wouldn't win this particular battle. He would just have to wait till no one was looking to slip away. After ensuring that Elijah wouldn't make another break for it, Azaleen once again took the lead. They needed to set themselves up with the establishment's madam, and she knew exactly where to go. "Azaleen, darling," she called out, her voice carrying a note of familiarity. "Are you here for another job, love?" Azaleen nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "Yeah, got more of Indy's business to handle," she said, resting a hand on the counter. "I've also got some new associates with me this time." At the mention of Indy's name, the receptionist's eyebrows shot up and a look of understanding dawned on her face. "Oh," she yelled while her lips formed a perfect O of surprise. "I see. Well, in that case, let me fetch Mara for you. She'll want to know about this personally." With a wink and a sway of her hips, the receptionist trotted off, disappearing behind a door that separated the tavern from the employee section. Azaleen let out a sigh, taking a moment to gather herself. But as she turned around to check on her companions, she noticed something odd. Both Bennett and Coleman were still there, peering around and gawking at everything with wide, curious eyes. But Elijah was gone. But before anyone could panic, Bennett casually jerked his head over to the right. "He's right here," he said in a dismissive tone. Coleman and Azaleen turned their heads, and there, indeed, was Elijah. He was seated at a table right next to them, his usual insufferable and charismatic smirk firmly in place, as he chatted with two rather unusual-looking individuals. One, an androgynous figure leaning more towards the feminine side, was adorned with a plumage of teal and white feathers instead of hair. The individual seemed even more slender than the catgirl courtesan as he stared at Elijah with a look of trepidation, while his partner seemed much more at ease. The feathered one's friend seemed to be a green-haired sun elf with a scruffy face and seemed to stare at Elijah as if he was less of a threat and more amusing. And that's when I was like, "What? Do you expect me to work in the fucking dark?" The punchline to Elijah's joke seemed to cause the elf to chuckle and place a hand on his face as a small smile cracked across his feathered partner's face. "Ahaha. Anyways, I'm Elijah, and my friends and we're somewhat new here. Maybe I can buy you a drink or two, and you two can tell us the word around here?" Elijah leaned forward a bit and placed a few copper-like coins on the table. "I'm kind of sick of dealing with scammy assholes that seem to fill this hellhole." The two local freelancers sitting across from Elijah exchanged a thoughtful glance. Initially, they were dubious of the man, but his strange yet amusing introduction and the mention of a free drink seemed to break the ice and shift their disposition into something accepting. They, too, experienced just how unfriendly the veteran freelancers who had already settled in were, and finding a friendly face or two would be a godsend for them. "Rivka," the feathered one said, introducing themselves with a slight nod. Talarian, the elf followed, his voice gruff, but not unfriendly. Elijah's face lit up, his grin widening. "Rivka, Talarian, it's a pleasure," he said, leaning forward conspiratorially. "You know, since we're all kinda new here, how about we team up? I know someone who could get us some work and you can't go wrong having more people on your first venture out, right?" Rivka and Talarian seemed to consider this. The man in front of them seemed just as new to the world of freelancing as they were. "I'd like to think we're interested," Talarian replied, looking at Rivka, who nodded. While Azaleen spoke to someone obscured by the doorway to the employees section of the tavern, Bennett and Coleman decided to join Elijah at his table. Their earlier worry transformed into a mix of intrigue and admiration as they observed Elijah's effortless command over the conversation. He exuded a sense of calm, his body language relaxed, and his smile genuine as he interacted with his newfound acquaintances. "So, you two are looking to be freelancers too?" Elijah asked, his tone casual and friendly. "I'm always curious to hear what draws people to take up mercenary work." Rivka and Talarian exchanged a glance, a brief moment of silent communication. It was clear they were still somewhat guarded, not quite ready to divulge too much about their personal histories. But Elijah, ever perceptive, quickly picked up on this. Instead of pressing the issue, he smoothly redirected the conversation. "I mean, you guys don't have to answer anything you don't want to, but you know. I've always found that the journey matters more than the destination, he said, leaning forward slightly. I'm more curious about what drew you to life, not what drove you. If that makes any sense. Elijah corrected himself with a smirk on his face as if he was expecting an exciting story. A silence lingered between the two groups. The green-haired elf wore a complicated face as he thought about the words, but Rivka allowed a thoughtful hum to leave his lips as he considered this stranger's question. The STYMPH's shoulders seemed to relax, and the tension seemingly dissipated from his posture as he smoothed a hand over the ruffled feathers on his head. You know, it's funny, Rivka began in a nostalgic tone. When I started practicing magic, I always dreamed of being a famous freelancer mage. He chuckled while his eyes wandered up in contemplation. It was this grand, romantic notion in my head, the idea of being at the top of the game, taking on jobs that no one else could handle. He chuckled softly, shaking his head. I imagined being so renowned that my name alone would open any door and make any taskers fight over the chance to contact me. Rivka grinned as his memory went back to how he used to imagine conjuring castle-shattering spells. And ultimately, the STYMPH's breath hitched, knowing he was going to let out an embarrassing dream. I've always fantasized about the idea of being a knower. Of having so much skill and influence that not only the freelancers and taskers alike ate from the palm of my hand, but also the nobility scrabbling to meet my acquaintance in order to make connections to me. That's the real dream. A snort of laughter left Talarian's mouth as he looked at Rivka as if he had said something absurd. You aim to be a knower? The elf man shifted his body and stared at his friend incredulously. I knew you had some lofty dreams, Riff, but that's just downright crazy. You'll find a far easier time managing to get official peerage. Shut up, Tal. Rivka shoved his partner, causing him to nearly spill his drink. Elijah had absolutely no idea what in the hell a knower was, but he sure as shit wasn't going to say that aloud. So he nodded in understanding and laughed at their antics as he chimed in with his own 2 cents. A knower, huh? He replied as if Ryevka had some impressive aspirations. I'm going to have to agree with your elven friend over here, that's a crazy dream. Elijah jutted a finger at Rivka and laughed while the STYMPH's feathers pressed against his head in embarrassment. After seeing Talarian's reaction and this new stranger's comment, Rivka's earlier enthusiasm dampened as he visibly deflated. However, a sly smile spread across Elijah's face as his voice took on a more conspiratorial tone. But don't you gotta be crazy to be someone? Rivka's eyes widened slightly as his head snapped up to look at the weird human. The STYMPH seemed to perk up and take on a tentative hope. You really think so? He asked, before looking at Talarian, who had his brows furrowed. Well, when you put it like that, the sun elf murmured as he scratched his growing scruff. The stranger had a point. Anyone who was anyone in that world was by default unhinged or crazy. So it made sense that someone who was crazy enough to chase after such dreams of grandeur was so by definition. With a widening grin, Elijah nodded as he saw they were responding well to his bullshit. I mean, that's how it goes, right? Those who dares wins. He said, excitedly elbowing both Bennett and Coleman in the side for his stupid little reference. Bennett scowled, rubbing his ribs where Elijah's elbow had made contact. Yeah, sure, whatever, he grumbled, not having to act too much to play the surly teammate. Coleman, on the other hand, just gave Elijah a hard, unamused stare. His jaw clenched as he watched his subordinate continue to deviate from what he considered appropriate behavior for their current situation. They were supposed to be undercover, gathering intel in hostile territory, and here was Elijah, not only drawing attention to them but actively recruiting strangers into their fold. It went against every instinct the team leader had, every bit of training that had been drilled into him. Maintaining a low profile, minimizing exposure, and sticking to the plan were the cornerstones of a successful operation. And Elijah seemed to be gleefully disregarding all of them. But as much as Coleman wanted to pull Elijah aside and chew him out, he knew he couldn't. Not here, not now. Elijah had already pulled them into this conversation and managed to establish a rapport with these locals. To break character now would only draw more suspicion. So Coleman forced a smile, trying his best to play along with the charade. That's right, he said, his tone strained despite his efforts to sound casual. Fortune favors the bold, as they say. But even as the words left his mouth, Coleman could feel the tension building in his shoulders, the vein in his temple beginning to throb. He shot Elijah a look that promised a serious discussion later when they were away from prying eyes and ears. For his part, Elijah knew exactly how Coleman felt about the situation. He could practically feel the waves of disapproval radiating off his team leader, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. And on some level, Elijah understood Coleman's perspective. The man was a stickler for rules, structure, and procedure. Following the well-established parameters of Special Forces operations gave him a sense of control and a feeling of security in an otherwise chaotic world. But what Coleman seemed to be struggling to grasp was the fact that those rules, those tried-and-true methods, no longer applied here. This wasn't some standard mission in a war-torn country or a covert operation in hostile territory. This was a whole new world, with magic and monsters and societal norms that defied everything they knew. In Elijah's mind, clinging to the old playbook was a surefire way to get them all killed. They needed to adapt, to improvise, to make up the rules as they went along. And that's exactly what he was doing. As far as Elijah was concerned, he was blazing a new trail, writing the guidebook for how to operate in this strange and dangerous land. Every conversation, every new connection, was another piece of the puzzle, another tool in their arsenal. As a matter of fact, he was in his element, charming and disarming. Sure, it was a gamble. Sure, there was always the risk that one of these new friends could turn on them. Sure, they could expose them to the outsiders they were. But in Elijah's estimation, the potential rewards far outweighed the risks. After all, they were flying blind here. They had no intel, no local support, and no way of knowing who to trust or what dangers lurked around every corner. Building a network and cultivating allies, even unlikely ones, could mean the difference between success and failure, between life and death. And so Elijah pressed on, his easy grin and quick wit drawing Rivka and Talarian further into his orbit. He could feel Coleman's gaze boring into the side of his head and could practically hear the gears turning as his team leader tried to figure out how to rein him in. But just as Elijah was about to continue his charm offensive, he noticed Azaleen waving at someone from the other side of the door she's standing near. The elven woman had a smile on her face, but there was a hint of tension in her eyes as she beckoned for the person to follow her. As the figure emerged from the doorway, Elijah couldn't help but do a double take. Walking towards their table was a woman, but not just any woman. She was a striking blend of human and canine features, with light brown hair that framed a pretty face and a pair of long, floppy ears that reminded Elijah of a beagle. However, it was her body that really caught his attention. She was a woman who packed on weight in all the right places, with curves that seemed to be the envy of every woman. Her hips swayed with each step, drawing the eye to her ample rear, while her bust strained against the fabric of her dress. It was a figure that was at once seductive and powerful, the kind of body that men would go to war over. As she approached, Elijah couldn't help the way this dog-like woman carried herself. Her steps were assured, her posture was straight, and there was a glint in her eye that spoke of intelligence and cunning. This was a woman who knew her own worth and was used to being in control. With his mind analyzing each minute detail of the woman in front of him, Elijah took on a noticeable shift in his demeanor as Azaleen stepped forward to introduce them to this madam. "Boys," the elf's voice carried over the din of the tavern, "I'd like you to meet Mara. She's the proprietress of this fine establishment." Mara smiled with her canine teeth glinting in the light. "Pleasure to meet you, gents." She greeted the table with a rich purr as her gaze traveled over each face. "Any friend of Azaleen's is a friend of mine." While everyone else remained seated, Elijah rose smoothly with a relaxed but confident posture. "Elijah," he replied, meeting her powerful gaze with his own. "And the pleasure's all mine. It's not every day you're personally welcomed by a stunning businesswoman." His compliment was casual, almost offhand, but his tone showed genuine appreciation. It wasn't the leering, aggressive kind of flattery that Mara was no doubt used to receiving from patrons. Instead, it was the honest admiration of a man who knew how to appreciate beauty without objectifying it. A coy smile spread across Mara's face. There had been many a man who complimented her for one thing or another, and the man in front of her was no different, even though he wasn't as crude about it. "Well, aren't you a charmer?" she said, her tail swishing behind her. Elijah grinned as his eyes continued to hold eye contact. "I just call it as I see it," he replied, offering a casual shrug. "But while you are gorgeous, I'm more impressed by the way you run this place." He gestured around the tavern, taking in the bustling crowd, the efficient staff, and the general air of controlled chaos. "How you've had the rough and tumble wrapped around your finger. How they don't even raise a voice at your girls, that's really the thing of beauty here." This time, a look of genuine surprise flashed across Mara's face, and a faint blush colored her cheeks. She glanced at Azaleen, who seemed to roll her eyes in a mix of exasperation and amusement. But Elijah wasn't done. He leaned forward, his eyes bright with interest as he continued. I mean, just look at how you've organized this place. Staff are on rotation, with eyes on every corner that are keep a watchful eye without being overbearing. That's not just good management. That's an art form. Mara's ears perked up, and her tail swished behind her as she listened. It was rare for anyone, especially a man, to notice the finer details of her operation. Most were too focused on the girls or drinks to bother with anything else. You're very observant, Mara replied, her voice taking on a note of respect. Not many people bother to look past the entertainment. A touch of mischief floated across his expression as he ran a hand through his wavy hair. What can I say? I appreciate the finer things in life. And a smoothly run operation is one of them. He paused, his head tilting slightly as he considered Mara. But you know what I appreciate even more? The way you treat your girls. I've seen a lot of places like this, and the way the ladies are handled, it's not always pretty. Clearing her throat for a moment, Mara's face softened as a flicker of something, pride, perhaps, or self-satisfaction, crossed her features. My girls are the heart of this place, she stated firmly. They're not just commodities, they're people. They deserve respect, safety, and fair treatment. Elijah nodded as his eyes closed briefly, and his smile turned gentle. And that, right there, is what sets you apart. Beauty, brains, and a heart. That's a rare combination. He explained as he pointed at her, emphasizing each trait he possessed. He then loosened his shoulders and relaxed his posture to be more open. It was a subtle gesture, but it was effective due to Mara's posture subconsciously mirroring his own. The way I see it, a person's character is revealed in how they treat those they have power over. And you, Mara, he winked, pointing at her again. Your character shines quite brightly. Mara ducked her head as a bashful giggle escaped her lips. It was a strangely girlish and rare sound that was usually at odds with her confident demeanor, but there was no mistaking that she was pleased by her flushed cheeks. You certainly have a way with words, don't you, Elijah? The tavern's madam finally replied after taking a few seconds to recollect herself. She then turned her attention to the two other humans seated at the table. And may I ask who your fine associates are? Elijah's eyes widened, and he smacked his forehead with the palm of his hand. Where are my manners? He exclaimed, a chagrined smile on his face. Here I am, flirting with a vaunted businesswoman like yourself, and I haven't even properly introduced my companions. He stood up straighter, extending his hand to introduce his group. The man with the dark brown hair is Bennett. And the blonde individual is our leader, Coleman. Ma'am, Bennett said, his tone respectful, while Coleman gave a curt nod with a more guarded expression. But he still met Mara's gaze evenly. Well, it's truly great to meet all of y'all, Mara replied, giving a short bow before turning her attention back to Elijah, a playful smile tugging at her lips. And I must say, I do appreciate your words, Elijah. It's not often I'm on the receiving end of such eloquent flattery. All right, that's enough, Azaleen finally interjected. She was sick and tired of this farce and wanted to get the show on the road already. We're here on business, remember? You two can flirt later if you want, but right now, I can't be asked to listen any more of your drivel. She shot a pointed look at Elijah. She then turned to Mara with an apologetic look on her face. See what I have to deal with? I told you he was a silver-tongued devil. A rich, but subdued chuckle left Mara's lips as she half covered her face with her hand. Oh, I can definitely see, she replied, her eyes sparkling with delight. But I can handle a little devilry, dear Azaleen. It keeps things interesting. She gestured for them to follow her, leading them toward a more secluded tavern corner. But you're right. We should get down to business. I have a feeling this will be an exciting conversation. As the group stood up to follow Mara, Elijah turned around to Rivka and Talarian with a smile. Hang around a bit, and I'll treat you to another drink. We got some business to take care of, okay? The elf and Lymph looked at each other momentarily before Talarian nodded with a grin. I'm not going to say no to a drink, he replied excitedly, rubbing his hands. Especially when it's free. Elijah knocked his knuckles on the table and pointed at Talarian. My man, he said before grabbing a small steamed bun and jogging to catch up with the others. As he joined the group, Elijah scanned the room for Yana until he spotted her diminutive form standing on a table, pointing at a dwarf with a thick brown beard and yapping at him as if she were giving a lecture. "Yana!" Elijah yelled out as he jutted his arm above his head, holding up the steamed bun like a trophy. The fairy's tiny head snapped towards him with an angry snarl before her eyes sparkled in recognition. Like a rocket, she took off for the man and snatched the bun out of his hand. As Yana settled on his shoulder and eventually his hood when Elijah ushered her inside, the man peered around to see if any in the tavern caught the scene. It was evident that almost everyone had, as they stared at him curiously before scoffing nonchalantly and returning to their own business. A problematic look floated across Elijah's face as he gauged everyone's reaction. He expected hushed murmurs or, well, any response other than dismissal. But it seemed that while Yana was an oddity, she wasn't entirely out of the realm of possibility here. Returning his attention to the group, Elijah slipped through the employee doorway and into the back room of the tavern, where the employees were bustling about. The medic took in the kitchen and couldn't help but marvel at its similarities with his home. There was definitely a magical twist to it as fires jutted out of strange, glowing magical stoves, while line cooks ran to and fro, cooking up a storm. Meanwhile, the male and female courtesans grabbed plates to serve customers or took turns in front of a mirror, sprucing themselves up. The back rooms were most definitely a hive of activity and seemed to mirror the hectic and festive atmosphere of the dining hall. Here, the air was filled with the sizzle of cooking food, the clatter of dishes, and the constant chatter of the staff as they went about their duties. But Elijah's eyes couldn't help but wander towards the courtesans that primped and preened, adjusting their dresses and touching up their makeup. They were a striking bunch, each one as enticing as the last, with a variety of races and features represented. There were even some of those Anaris girls with long, flowing manes and delicate features, their curved horns adorned with glittering jewels. There were beastkin girls with soft, furry ears and tails of every type as they playfully bantered. But the bulk of not just the courtesans but the staff, in general, was made up of humans or sun elves as they giggled and practiced seductive poses. Shaking his head, Elijah dismissed his lust and followed the group through the bustling back room and into Mara's small, private office. She stood by the door and ushered them inside before closing the door behind them and effectively cutting off the noise and activity of the kitchen. The office itself was surprisingly cozy, with plush chairs arranged around a low table and tasteful decorative textiles on the walls. Mara then gestured for them to sit while taking her own place behind a small desk lined with magical instruments that seemed to be used for counting coins and booking. "Now then," she sighed, transitioning to a more business-oriented posture and tone. "Let's talk about why you're really here." Mara leaned back in her chair, throwing one leg over the other as she gently crossed her arms. The beastkin woman's expression was one of mild skepticism while her eyes narrowed slightly at the group. "You see, here's the thing," she began in a measured voice. "I haven't received any notice to shelter you. No instructions, no details, no payment," Mara hummed as she eyed each and every face. "And it's especially unsettling when it's supposedly coming from Indy, Einhar, or whichever of Kjadner's lieutenants decided to stick their nose into my neck of the woods." A soft chuckle left her mouth as her gaze seemed to bore a hole into Azaleen. "I've got to say, it's a bit suspect. Usually, when there's work to be done, I get some kind of heads up. A little something to let me know what's what." Azaleen started to stammer, and a panicked look crossed her face when she realized she'd been caught in a lie. "Well, you see," she began with faltering words. It's not exactly a typical job, per se." It was clear that Azaleen, for all her physical might and street smarts, was not the most eloquent speaker under pressure. Her usual confidence seemed to have deserted her and left her floundering for an explanation. The suspicion seemed to mount as Mara frowned and started tapping her arm rhythmically. "Now, out of respect for our friendship, Azaleen, and—" She paused, her eyes lingering on Elijah as a coy smile played on her lips. "The rather favorable first impression your friend has made, I'm more than willing to adhere to the non-disclosure agreement that comes with your usual business." Her expression then turned serious. "But if you're here for personal reasons, then I'm afraid I will have to turn you away. I'm barely able to keep my establishment open with that imperial bastard constantly raising operating costs on us. Bringing more attention would be untenable." Like a cat having caught her tongue, Azaleen seemed to deflate as she struggled to respond. Her eyes flickered to Elijah in a plea for help, and ever the smooth operator, Elijah let out a relaxed chuckle and stepped in to rescue the situation. That, Mara, is exactly the problem we're here to solve, he interjected, leaning forward with a confident smile. We're specialists, you see. And these Imperials have been hampering operations for far more than yourself. He added, understanding that the best lies were shrouded in truth. Our task is to remove these troublesome elements to ease business and operations for more than just you, Indy, or whoever else. He reached into the pouch at his side, the same one he had filled with coins from the burned-out village. With a flourish, he pulled out a strange, glowing gold coin and held it up, letting it catch the light. There's a substantial reward for resolving this issue, Elijah smiled at Mara as he deftly maneuvered the coin between his fingers. And of course, we have your payment as well. But I feel as if a new set of terms are in order, and we're not beyond negotiations. He smiled smugly when he saw Mara's eyes widen. The way he spoke and the casual confidence in his tone implied that Elijah held all the cards and that he was dictating this arrangement's terms. But in truth, Elijah was flying blind. He had no concept of the coin's actual worth, no understanding of its place in this world's commerce and magic. But it seemed that the calculated bluff seemed to pay off as Mara's breath hitched and her eyes locked onto the ethereal coin dancing between Elijah's deft fingers. Her posture tensed, and a flicker of recognition, tinged with a hint of avarice, flashed across her features. Is that a soul coin? She whispered with a voice full of hunger. But before she could finish her thought, she caught herself, clearing her throat with a deliberate ahem. Narrowing her eyes at Elijah, Mara's expression shifted to one of calculated intrigue. You're a bold one, aren't you? She said, her tone a blend of admiration and caution. Usually, I have a fixed price for my services, a standard fee that applies to all, even to those in Indy's employ. She leaned back in her chair, her ears twitching as she appraised Elijah with a newfound interest. But, given the sensitive nature of dealing with the Imperials in this town, I would normally reject any offer outright, no matter the amount. However, Mara purred as her gaze drifted back to the glowing coin, and a hungry glint entered her eyes. Since I find you enjoyable, and you come bearing such intriguing currency, I might be open to negotiation. Elijah's grin widened as he saw the glimmer of interest in Mara's eyes. He had her right where he wanted her. 30%, he gave a highball percentage, with a casual tone and an intense gaze. Mara's eyes widened, and she let out an audible gasp. Her body tensed, and for a moment, it seemed as if she immediately accepted. But then Mara paused as her expression smoothed, and her posture relaxed into one of careful nonchalance. 30%, you say, she purred, her voice a silken caress. That's quite a generous offer. She leaned forward, her elbows resting on the table in a way to emphasize her cleavage and her chin cradled in her hands. But accepting such an offer with nothing in return would more than surely spoil any future business you would provide. Mara's look and smile indicated she was very interested in Elijah. I'll accept your terms, and in return, I'll ensure that your stay here is not just productive, but... The dog-like woman paused as she bit her low lip. Very amicable. Duchess Varasha stood in the center of this castle's throne room with her eyes fixed on the small pile of severed heads at her feet. With a look of utter disdain, she tossed another onto the small grisly mound as the lifeless eyes of the once proud noble stared up at her in mute accusation. The dragonkin noblewoman's feathers bristled with barely contained rage as she turned to face Theraval, her dark elf spymaster. Have the rest fallen in line? She demanded in a low, menacing growl. I will not tolerate any dissent, not now, not when so much hangs in the balance. Ever the picture of calm composure, Theraval inclined his head in a respectful bow. Your Grace, he began in a measured and even tone, the vast majority have indeed capitulated to your demands. The display of decisive action against Count Harmswood and his ilk has sent a powerful message. Varasha's sneer deepened, her eyes narrowing to slits of barely contained fury. So they have chosen to bend the knee? Are there any that are foolish enough to harbor thoughts of defiance? Theraval's expression remained impassive, but there was a glint of something dark in his eyes, a hint of the ruthless efficiency that had made him such a valuable asset to the Duchess. A few harbor resentment. But I shall see they never come to fruition, Your Grace. My agents have eyes and ears everywhere. The Duchess's tail lashed behind her as a physical manifestation of her simmering anger. See that they are, Theraval. I want not a shred of disobedience among the lords and ladies. If any dare to defy me, you know what must be done. Bowing his head once more, Theraval gave a solemn vow. It will be as you command, Your Grace. Any who stand against you will be made to see the error of their ways, or they will be removed, root and stem. Varasha huffed, a plume of angry fire jetting from her nostrils as she turned away, her ornate cloak fluttering in the air with the abruptness of her movement. She stalked across the room, her eyes darting from one side to another, from advisor to attendant, as if daring any of them to voice even a hint of protest. But none did. They stood silent and still, with their gazes averted and their postures subservient. They knew, all too well, the price of drawing their mistress's ire. With a flick of Varasha's wrist and a snap of her finger and summoned Ank's Sestri to her side. The first to approach was the pale-skinned, blonde-haired high elven man who stepped forward with his long and droopy 12-inch ears. His delicate features remained impassive as he fell in step and cleared his throat. Just behind him, Sestri, the towery commander, limped to her mistress' other side. The Duchess's eyes immediately snapped to Sestri, taking in her uneven gait and the tension in her posture. "How have you been dealing with these incursions?" Varasha demanded in a low, menacing rumble. "How fare my dragons and wyverns?" Sestri flinched at the question. Fear was evident in her eyes as she carefully considered her response. "Why, Your Grace," she began with a trembling voice, "we've implemented new tactics to combat the raiders by staging dragons and wyverns in the forests near known problem areas and potential targets." She swallowed hard, her tail twitching nervously behind her. "At worst, we've managed to scare off a few raids. At best, we've wiped out a band or two. But, these otherworlders, they travel in small packs, and their coordination is uncanny." Sestri's voice then became quiet as she looked down nervously. "They seem to communicate in ways that are alien to us, and it's proving problematic." Varasha's eyes narrowed, and her feathers bristled with growing anger. "That is indeed worrying, but how fare my dragons and wyverns?" She repeated herself slowly as she glared at the trembling Sestri. Hesitation seemed to overcome the towery as her eyes started to swim wildly, and her shoulders hunched as if to ward off a blow. They have weapons, Your Grace. Strange, magical devices, and they're proving deadly." Another silence came over the throne room before the Duchess's tail lashed like a crack of the whip, chipping the floor. "You fool," she hissed, her voice dripping with disdain. "Why not simply fly high, out of reach of their weapons? You have command of the very skies, do you not?" Sestri seemed to shrink under Varasha's verbal onslaught as the towery's body language screamed submission. We tried, Your Grace. But if they fly anywhere higher than a few hundred meters, then spears from unseen places hurtle through the sky, felling our anything and everything before we even know they're there." She shuddered, her voice dropping to a haunted whisper. The dragons also describe something like an all-seeing eye that stabs at their hides." Sestri threw up her hands in front of herself and started backing up while Varasha slowly approached. "It's omnipotent and everywhere, and only when it's too late do the dragons know which of them is being targeted." Varasha's face contorted with rage, the claws of her feet digging into the stone floors as she hissed and snapped her head away. "Foul things." Of course, that wasn't exaggerated as well. She snarled before slamming her hand into her face. She had read those reports and didn't want to believe it. The very idea that these otherworlders possessed a spear capable of homing in on their aerial force and slamming into them at speed unheard of was galling. It struck at the very heart of her military might, the core of her strategic advantage. "Those things must be operating on the edge of the periphery, near the rift itself," Sestri added after finally putting her hands down once she realized her liege's anger was no longer oriented towards her. "And when our dragons venture close, they feel the gaze of an innumerable amount of more focused eyes upon them before meeting a barrage of these spears." A sigh left Varasha's mouth as she stood there for a while. If this were the case, then she had to assume the worst-case scenario: they'd lose air superiority, and it fast. The only advantage she could possibly conceive of was now going to be used against her, and if she didn't err on the side of caution, then her most mighty assets would be lost before even putting up a fight. Turning to Ankh, Varasha looked at him with exhausted eyes. "Tell me you have something," she beckoned with a voice that said she was on the edge of insanity. "Tell me any semblance of good news." When he stepped forward, Ankh's expression remained cool and emotionless. "Your Grace," he began, bowing deeply and speaking in a steadfast and even tone. "I do indeed have good news. The mages you have placed under my command are already in the process of learning the fundamentals of illusion magic, while those who already possess such knowledge are being taught to amplify their abilities with the strengths of others." Varasha's eyes relaxed as a flicker of hope sparked in their depths. but it was quickly tempered as her tail lashed behind her. At least something isn't going straight to the infinite hells, she grumbled, shooting her hand up to rub at her snout in an attempt to dispel the pounding headache that threatened to split her skull. She began to walk again with Sestri, Ankh, and an entourage of guards following close behind. Her guards spread out to form a protective barrier around their duchess, scanning for any sign of an assassin after her display of authority over the nobles of the empire. For a long moment, Varasha was silent, her eyes closed as she walked, lost in thought. Her mind kept wandering back to the partly allotment of dragons and wyverns Varian had oh so gracious bestowed upon her. She would make good use of them, of course, but the bulk of her forces still came from her own house. Varsha couldn't help but thank the heavens she had the wisdom and foresight to realize those conniving bastards that belonged to the royal family were going to try to screw her over. But still, the possibility of losing heir superiority greatly disturbed her. Finally, the Duchess spoke with a voice heavy with weariness and worry. "The leaders of this great empire have ordained that I die here," she said with disdain in her voice. "I bet they thought I was a fool just like they are and would consider this report of what they encountered on the other side and what they managed to learn from captured enemy soldiers and equipment." She shook her head, a mirthless laugh escaping her lips. "At first, I thought they were, but no force capable of making a celestial and an elder horde of dragons run with its tail between its legs should be taken lightly." Varsha's monologue causes a few guards to send a worried glance toward their mistresses before returning to their vigil. "Tell me, Ankh, should I also believe those otherworld prisoners' words of flying contraptions that fly higher than any of even the skyborn?" The question seemed to catch her subordinate by surprise as she turned to face him with a grim expression. What of the fanciful tales of eyes in the void itself? Ever watching and ever listening? Ankh thought the question rhetorical for a moment, but the Duchess's eyes remained fixated on him, expecting an answer. Ahem, the high elven man cleared his throat. "It is not my place to dictate any strategy to one as great as yourself, mistress," he said, seeing the irritation grow on his mistress's face, and immediately followed up with, "However, I would deem it ill-advised to ignore these rumors, regardless of how far-fetched." A fiery snort left Varasha's nostrils as she flipped around and started walking again. "Then I shall take it as fact," she declared as her brain started to turn. "We must assume those things are capable of gathering intelligence and acting on it in near real time, a feat I've only seen matched by the druids under the cover of their accursed forest." Varasha's claws clenched, digging into her scales and threatening to pierce it. "Intelligence and actionable intelligence will be the driving factors in this war. And as it stands, I put our chances of success at very low." She started in a dark tone as her head bowed. "But we have little choice." She straightened, her posture to be more regal and determined even as the weight of her words hung heavy in the air. "We must adapt, and we must do so quickly. These otherworlders, they operate in ways we've never encountered. Their tactics, their weapons, their very way of thinking, it's all alien to us." As Varasha retreated into her thoughts, she and her entourage finally found themselves on the balcony overlooking the sprawling city below. The sight was breathtaking as a sea of glowing, and sometimes even floating buildings stretched out to the horizon where it met the glittering expanse of the ocean. But as Varasha turned her head, her gaze was drawn to the other direction, to the vast forests that bordered the city. And it was there, staring out at those ancient trees, that a thought struck her. A realization that cut through her frustration and worry like a beam of clarity. "Sestri," the Duchess narrowed her eyes as her voice suddenly became calm and even. "Your methods for deterring these raiders' attacks. Keep it up," she said, snapping her head towards her. Sestri looked up, surprised, and a flicker of pride in her eyes. "Your Grace? It seems you are the only one holding the wolves at bay," Varasha replied quietly before turning to her guard captain. "I am recalling the dragons and wyverns from everyone except Sestri's command. Have them regroup and prepare for new orders." The guard captain bowed deeply and his feathered helmet nearly touched the ground. "As you command, Your Grace," he responded before quickly marking within the castle. The Duchess then turned back to Sestri, fixing the Towery with an intense stare. "You're doing good work, Commander. Keep on with your mission and do your best to keep these menaces at bay," Varasha ordered before jerking her head towards the castle. "Now, go." Sestri bowed deeply, her tail curling behind her in a gesture of respect. "I will not fail you, Your Grace," she replied while running off to carry out her Duchess's order, albeit with a limp. Once the Towery disappeared into the confines of the citadel, Varasha turned to Ankh as her mind raced with the beginnings of a plan. We must use our magic to counter their alien advantages, she declared, crossing her arms and looking back out towards the forest. Across the entirety of the savage lands wound a cold mist deployed, thick enough to prevent their eyes in the sky from penetrating, from seeing any figure and even the heat of our forces. Ankh nodded as his expression became thoughtful. A simple enough task, Your Grace. Our mages can maintain such a mist indefinitely. Good, Varasha said, her tail flicking behind her. But that's just the start. In the very forests, I want dragons and wyverns stationed everywhere and hidden away. They will serve as our reaction force, intercepting any flying threats that dare to venture into our airspace. Varasha began to hum in interest, her mind whirling with possibilities. We will need to refine this further. There may be a possibility of utilizing illusions for this as well. She pointed at Ankh as she paced back and forth. Maybe when they react to any intrusion, they could manifest a horde of illusions. An even look remained on Ankh's face as his eyes followed the Duchess. A brilliant strategy, Your Grace. We'll also need to worry about these high-flying contraptions, the dragonkin grumbled as she turned back to the balcony, her gaze sweeping over the city, only to see the beams of light from the entertainment district and the projections of the merchant district. Suddenly, Varasha clapped her hands together, her eyes widening with a sudden burst of inspiration. Magic missile, she exclaimed, her voice ringing with excitement and determination. Ankh blinked, taken aback by the Duchess's outburst. Your Grace? He asked, confusion and curiosity warring in his tone. Varasha spun to face him, her features alight with the fire of newfound purpose. The younger dragons, Ankh. We'll pull them back, station them in the skies above our forces. Trying to follow the Duchess's train of thought, the high elf's brow furrowed in trepidation. This was his realm of expertise, and he had read those reports himself. If these otherworlders indeed possess the ability to go so high, some mage casting a magic missile on the back of a dragon would be impossible. However, he decided to humor the woman lest she take her ire out on him. And when they spot something? He asked in a cautious tone. The Duchess snorted plumes of flames out of her nostrils as wore an almost feral glint in her eye. That's where the mages come in. We'll assign them in teams of 20, linked to each dragon through the Leporini mystics. She gestured wildly as if her hands painted a picture of the strategy unfolding in her mind. When a dragon spots a target, the mages will focus their power and launch a concentrated magic missile. That would be guided by the dragon, Ankh said slowly as his eyes widened and comprehension dawned. It was an absolutely ridiculous and unwieldy solution to an equally ridiculous problem, but it was still a tenable solution. Guided magic missiles, he breathed as awe and appreciation colored his words. Shamanistically linked and dragon-directed guided magic missiles. As Ankh contemplated the Duchess's proposed strategy, a glimmer of hope bloomed within Varasha's heart. She wasn't entirely convinced that they would emerge victorious from this conflict, but the idea of a stalemate, or at least delaying her demise, suddenly seemed within reach. While Varasha's mind raced with possibilities, Ankh remained standing before her, his own thoughts whirling with the intricacies and implications of such a complex system of magic and linked casters. It would require extensive testing, refinement, and coordination, but it was a start. Calming down her excitement, Varasha turned to him and her other aides and continued to lay the groundwork for their new strategy and directives. The smaller dragons will serve as our early warning system, she declared, her voice ringing with authority. They will scan the heavens, high and low, providing us with the intelligence we need to respond to any aerial threats. She then turned her attention to one of her advisors, who had been waiting patiently while his mistress spoke to the high elf. The general was a human named Maldro, and as Varasha's focus shifted to him, he straightened up to make himself seem more presentable. Maldro, Varasha began in a serious, but hesitant tone. Her expertise wasn't in the realm of ground warfare, and she needed the specialist knowledge of the man who had tamed the Towery in the first place. We need to develop a strategy for bogging down the otherworldly forces on the ground. A way to slow their advance, to bleed them as much as we can before they can reach our citadels and strongholds. The general stroked his long gray beard while his mind raced with possibilities. The parameters his mistress gave him weren't ideal, but if the goal wasn't an outright victory but to bog down the enemy as much as possible, then he believed there were a few pages he could take from races he helped subjugate. We could start digging tunnels and constructing fortifications between the forest lines, Your Grace, he answered finally after a few long seconds of silence. We allow the otherworldly forces to advance uninterrupted, avoid open battles, and draw them into choke points and critical junctions using inferior forces. Considering the proposal, Varasha's eyes narrowed. She wasn't keen on sacrificing resources in such an unsustaining way, but she felt her general was onto something. Go on, she prompted, her tail flicking behind her. With hands gesturing confidently, Muldrow continued his proposal as he stepped towards the balcony facing the forests and pointed towards the tree line. Our superior forces could use the tunnels and forests to maneuver unseen, popping out to attack the enemy's flanks and rear before melting back into cover. We hit them hard and fast, then disappear before they can mount an effective response. Varasha pondered Muldrow's proposal, her mind raced with the implications and potential drawbacks of such a strategy. It was a plan that lacked honor and was unnecessarily wasteful, a far cry from the military doctrine of overwhelming force that the Empire used for centuries. But these were desperate times, and desperate measures were called for. The very survival of their way of life hung in the balance, and Varasha knew that clinging to old notions of honor and integrity would only lead to their doom. Still, a pang of regret shot through her, accompanied by a hiss of self-contempt. She had told Theraval to disregard the levy men and focus solely on the mana users and mages. But now, faced with the grim realities of the war ahead, she realized the folly of that decision. They were going to need every able body, every mundane soul, to stand against the otherworldly tide. For all their lack of magical prowess, the masses could still serve as a bulwark, a way to absorb the enemy's blows and buy precious time for their more skilled forces to strike. Shaking her head, Varasha pressed her hands to her face, her claws digging into her scales. It was a bitter pill to swallow, a concession to the harsh necessities of their situation. But there was no other choice. Muldrow, she said, her voice heavy with resignation, see to it that we have sufficient bodies to blunt the main advance. Conscript them into the auxiliaries, give them what training and equipment we can spare. The general bowed low, his fist clenched over his heart. As you command, Your Grace. But, Muldrow lifted himself and hesitated as concern crossed his face. Your Grace, for this strategy to work, our forces will need to be incredibly coordinated. Lines will need to fall back as one, and our troops will need to know exactly when to pull back and when to stand and fight. I am aware, General. And I have a solution. The Duchess replied and waved her hand dismissively. I will use everything, including my personal wealth to get what we need and finance this strategy. She said, looking at every face. We shall get every diviner, any communication tools the artificers can mass-produce to ensure that every field commander, down to the lowest ranks, can receive and relay orders. Silence reigned on the balcony as the aides and advisors present lowered their heads in a mix of respect and trepidation. The fact that their liege would dip into her own coffers highlighted how worried she was about the situation and the enormity of the task they were to undertake. Varasha surveyed the room, her gaze fierce and unyielding. Go, she commanded, her voice ringing with authority. Do not waste time. Every second counts. In unison, the assembled officials bowed low, their fists clenched over their hearts. Your will shall be done, they intoned, their voices a solemn chorus. With that, they departed. Each aide and advisor hurried into the castle's depths to begin the monumental work ahead. Messengers were dispatched, orders were given, and the great machinations of the Empire's war effort began to grind into motion. Alone on the balcony, Varasha turned her gaze northward toward the endless sea of buildings and forests stretching to the horizon, where the Empire resided. A scowl twisted her features, and hatred filled her heart. And she knew, with a certainty that burned in her gut, that the insipid General Korthax and that filthy wretched of an emperor were watching her every move. She was no fool. Varasha knew they were analyzing her strategies, weighing her decisions, and looking for any insight into how to deal with the threat they themselves had brought to this realm. They were using her, she realized with a snarl. Using her as a test subject, a guinea pig to try out their own twisted schemes. They would watch her struggle, watch her fight and bleed and die, all the while taking notes and poaching her best ideas. Just as they had done with the Towery. Damn you both to the infinite hells, Varasha hissed, her claws digging into the balcony railing. This world would have been a far better place if those two had been stillborn. Toivonen was the very definition of overworked as she sat in her chair, surrounded by a sea of papers, blinking monitors displaying an innumerable number of emails, and her incessantly vibrating phone indicating yet another incoming call. The sensory overload was almost unbearable, and she let out a groan of frustration before snatching the incessant device and seeing it was one of her aides. What? What is now? she barked into the receiver while her free hand massaged her temples. But as the aide continued their report, Toivonen's scowl shifted from one of annoyance to outright pain. She smothered her face with her free hand, trying to contain the frustration that threatened to boil over. Yes, yes, yes. I understand the offensive is imminent, she ground out through gritted teeth. But we're still working on getting assets into play. There was a pause as the voice on the other end of the line spoke, and Toivonen's eyes rolled back in exasperation. She let out an exaggerated ugh, before yanking the tie that held her hair in place, allowing her dark locks to cascade down her shoulders. Well, they need to wait, she snapped, her patience wearing thinner by the second. We don't know what we're facing on the other side of the rift besides what the POWs and cooperating informants have told us, and their perspectives are so skewed that they might as well be useless. Toivonen swiveled in her chair, facing the stack of reports piled high on her desk. With a grumble, she started opening folders and tossing them aside one by one, her eyes scanning the pages with growing frustration. Ever since Azale's meetings with the engineers and scientists, leadership has been obsessed with this counteroffensive. Greedy fucks, she muttered to herself, with a tone dripping with disdain. Find a few new resources, and all of a sudden, everyone's full of fucking bloodlust. The voice on the phone continued to speak, and Toivonen threw her hands up in a gesture of utter exasperation. She let them fall, slapping her leg in the process. Well, my paramilitary officers have only managed to make headway with the local peasantry, she exclaimed, her voice rising with each word. What am I supposed to do with a bunch of farmers? Start a goddamn pitchfork uprising, that'll get torched by one of those flying dinosaurs. She leaned back in her chair, the phone pressed tightly to her ear. If we go in now, we'll essentially be going in deaf, dumb, and blind. She barked into the phone. We need to understand at least what the enemy is capable of and get a grasp on their overall strategy. We don't even have a faint idea of what their force structure is. Toivonen's free hand rubbed at her eyes, trying to ease the pressure that was starting to build up in her head. She was tired, frustrated, and more than a little bit scared. She juggled so many projects with so much at stake that she experienced sensory overload every waking moment. To top it all off, the entire world was on the precipice of something so monumental it would change human history forever. And yet, the idiots in Congress wanted to stumble forward with barely a clue of what lay ahead. Listen, she said, her voice taking on a more serious tone. I know those fossils and legislator and brass is chomping at the bit to get this show on the road. But rushing in without proper intel, without a solid plan, is incredibly stupid. She straightened in her seat while pointing intently at nothing in particular. I need more time. We have to get this right, or we're going to have another Iraq or Afghanistan. The voice on the other end of the line spoke again, causing Toivonen to slap herself in the face. She knew she was asking for the impossible, and she knew that the gears of war were already turning, with or without her blessing. But she still had to delay this push for as long as she could until they could get some semblance of an idea of who they were fighting. I don't know, just find a way to stall it, she screamed, throwing her free hand up in frustrated desperation. A month. I just need a month, or as close to a month as you can get. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Toivonen could hear the muffled grumblings of dissent. For a moment, she thought they might actually refuse, and that her plea would fall on deaf ears. But then, like a ray of hope piercing through the clouds, she heard the magic words. Thank God, she breathed, falling backward into her chair as the aide on the other line yelled obscenities at her. I know. I know. Thank you for at least try. But before she could finish, the line went dead, and the angry huff of her aide was the last thing she heard before the call disconnected. However, Toivonen didn't mind that in the slightest. They could toss her out of the window in anger, for all she cared. All that mattered was that someone was going to fight to get her the time she so desperately needed. A small breath of relief left Toivonen's mouth as she set her phone down and bowed her head in exhaustion. Christ, have mercy, she muttered weakly. Everything in the past 6 or 7 months had been overwhelming to a degree that she could have sworn she aged 20 years. By being in the right place at the right time and saying the right thing, Toivonen was promoted to an executive position within the agency. While her ascension was unusual for someone her age, it was wholly unfeasible or even uncalled for, given the context. Her role in turning Azale into an asset that would work with the United States, along with her management of an enemy combatant turned operative, propelled her into the limelight. These facts made Toivonen the only reasoned choice for the position of Chief of Rift Anomalies and Operations. But with her rapid ascension into power came significant backlash. Tension simmered between her and the other executives in the agency, many of whom questioned her lack of experience and seniority. This scrutiny often placed her in difficult and awkward situations, forcing her to prove her worth constantly. She struggled with the challenges her inexperience brought, sometimes nearly proving her detractors right. However, she always found a way to succeed and even excel, whether through sheer luck or unconventional methods. Nevertheless, the pressure and stress was taking its toll as Toivonen bent down, slipped off her designer high-heeled stilettos, and tossed them across the room. The woman didn't even bother to look where she threw them or check where they landed as the shoes clattered against the wall. For 5 whole minutes, Toivonen just sat there hanging her head, allowing her hair to block out the oppressive, clinical white light above. Those 5 quiet minutes were a depressing but much-needed reprieve from the chaos that constantly surrounded her. But she knew she couldn't afford to stay like this, no matter how badly she wanted to call her boss and tell him she was taking a vacation. There was too much at stake and too much work to be done. With a sigh that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul, Toivonen raised herself up and dove back into the fray. She had a mountain of paperwork to get through before heading off to Quantico for yet another damn meeting. As she reached for the first stack of reports, a particular folder caught her eye. It was from Azale's quite sizable mountain, with each document detailing her involvement with the defense contractors, universities, or governmental departments. Toivonen's brow furrowed as she grabbed the Department of Energy document and began scanning. With each passing paragraph, Toivonen's eyes started to twitch, and her head started to spin from the incomprehensible nerd speech. But she couldn't deny that whatever they were talking about in this report was one of the man culprits who had whipped the government into a psychotic frenzy. According to the report, Azale had been working closely with DOE scientists and engineers, sharing her knowledge of magical principles and helping them integrate these concepts into existing energy frameworks. Mana crystals, ley lines, and elemental cores were just a few of the detailed resources, and each one promised a different revolution in energy production and efficiency. However, the proposed advanced theoretical frameworks and practical implementations for alternative energy generation and manipulation, insights derived from interdimensional sources, really caught Toivonen's attention. Grounded in principles of equivalence, consent, and reciprocity, it delved into a framework for harnessing magic by utilizing the principles it seemed to operate by. As Toivonen delved into the report, her eyes widened unevenly in a mixture of confusion and disbelief. The language was dense, filled with technical jargon and complex equations that supposedly blended the arcane with the scientific. Not that Toivonen could decipher either, if she was honest with herself. Opening a random page, Toivonen started reading aloud in a hesitant and perplexed voice, thinking that vocalizing the report would give her a modicum of understanding. The fundamental principle of magical energy manipulation, as demonstrated by the consultant, revolves around the concept of mana weaving. This process involves precisely manipulating previously unobserved ambient particles, which interact with matter and energy to create localized disturbances in the fabric of reality. Toivonen's brow furrowed as she tried to make sense of the words. Through a series of intricate gestures and specific chanting to enhance mental focus, the practitioner can weave these particles into complex patterns, which then manifest as tangible effects in the physical world. The most basic of these effects, as demonstrated by the consultant, is the creation of a small, self-sustaining luminous orb, colloquially referred to as a light spell. She squinted at the page, her eyes straining to follow the complex diagrams and notations accompanying the text. The creation of this light spell involves a 3-stage process. First, the practitioner must gather ambient particles into a localized area, creating a high energy density. This is achieved through a combination of gestures, spoken chants, or deep concentration. Each one conjures a complex series of images in one's mind's eye. Next, she continued, her voice growing more strained, the practitioner must use their mind's eye to shape this gathered energy into a stable form. This is done by visualizing, in great detail, the desired outcome, in this case, a luminous orb, and using further gestures to help stabilize and mold the mana particles into that shape. The final stage involves activating the shaped mana, which is achieved through a specific mental command and a small influx of the practitioner's own bodily energy reserves. At this point, Toivonen couldn't take it anymore. She stopped reading and threw her hands up in exasperation. "Goddamn nerds," she muttered, tossing the report aside. She reached for the next folder on her desk, hoping for something more comprehensible. But as she flipped it open, she was greeted by a similar wall of jargon and complex diagrams. Department of Agriculture, she read aloud in an unamused and flat tone. Potential applications of alien flora in crop enhancement and pest control. With a groan, she tossed that one aside as well. The next folder was from the Department of Health, detailing the possible medical uses of magical herbs and potions. Then came reports from the Department of Defense, the Environmental Protection Agency, and even the Federal Aviation Administration. Twivenen stopped a third way through the stack of documents and piled it back onto her desk. The exhausted woman couldn't help but glare at the reports. The sheer scope and potential impact of these discoveries were staggering, and it was no surprise that every corner of the government was clamoring to be involved. The decision to move through the rift had been overwhelming and bipartisan, save for a few contrarian extremists voting no. However, there was a near-universal agreement amongst the entire government that this was a golden opportunity for the United States. And why wouldn't there be? The applications of magic, or previously unobserved ambient particles, as the scientists insisted on calling them, were seemingly limitless. It could revolutionize energy, agriculture, healthcare, defense, hell, and even the entertainment industry. Every facet of society would be drastically changed by this magical revolution, and the United States of America would be at the epicenter of it all. They would have an ironclad monopoly on the most transformative technology since the advent of the computer. But as exciting as the thought of a Gilded Age for America and its allies was, Twivenen couldn't shake the sense of unease that gnawed at her gut. She wasn't worried about the invasion itself. No, that would be messy regardless of whether she could get people on the inside or not. What really kept her up at night was what came after the fighting. Another global war on terror was absolutely not an option. They couldn't afford to blunder into this new world half-cocked, guns blazing, and hopes high. They needed to understand the people they were dealing with. They needed to understand their culture, their values, and the very fabric of their society. Without that knowledge, without that deep, nuanced understanding, they risked making the same mistakes they had made time and time again. Imposing their will and their way of life on a population they didn't comprehend and, in return, reap a whirlwind of resentment and resistance that would inevitably follow. No, they needed to infiltrate their society, and they needed it fast. With a renewed sense of urgency, Twivenen rolled her chair towards her computer and started scrolling through the reports from the veritable horde of Special Operations Forces and her paramilitary officers. Twivenen's eyes scanned her screen while murmuring under her breath. She searched for any glimmer of good news, any sign of progress. Contact was made with local farmers. Initial negotiations are promising. There is potential for further infiltration. She uttered while in the search for any glimmer of good news. Observations of village hierarchy, preliminary assessment of economic structures, possible avenues for exploitation. Again, useful information, but nothing groundbreaking. Nothing that would give them the edge they needed to truly understand and manipulate this society. For hours, Twivenen continued her search until her eyes caught the time and realized she needed to get going to that meeting in Virginia. Another sigh left her leaning back in her chair, rubbing her temples in a vain attempt to ward off the impending headache. It seemed today was going to be a bust as well. Twivenen knew that she was pushing her people hard. Her officers were working their asses off in uncharted territory, trying to make inroads where they could, but they were on a very delicate timeline. Every day, every hour that passed without a significant breakthrough, was another straw piled up onto the camel's back that would ultimately end with another unsustainable occupation. Giving her screen one more glance, Twivenen continued scrolling through the reports until a particular entry caught her eye. It was from an Army Special Forces team, detailing their successful infiltration into a village and the establishment of a clandestine forward operating base for other special operations forces in the area. Initially, she was about to click away, her mind already moving on to the next potential lead, but something about the phrasing gave her pause. Established as a forward operations base, she muttered to herself, her brow furrowing deeply. That sounded more significant than the usual recon and contact reports she'd been seeing. The fact that they had managed to set up a functional base in enemy territory intrigued her. Deciding to read further, Twivenen started to murmur as she scanned through the report, and her eyes slowly started to widen with each point of interest. Dismantling an enemy company that was employing scorched earth tactics, clearing a village and ingratiating themselves to the survivors, using survivors to infiltrate another village, launch a snatch and grab operation and bagging a low-ranking noble. Twivenen stopped halfway through the document before scrolling up to look at the Special Forces team's profile. Who are these guys? As she reviewed each member's dossier, a flicker of recognition sparked in her mind. This wasn't just any special forces team, it was the very problem child who had somehow attracted the attention of a fairy goddess from the other side. A chuckle of amusement left Toivonen's mouth as she placed a hand on her face. She had been so swamped with higher priority tasks that she had almost completely forgotten they existed. She had case officers who were supposed to keep close tabs on their progress, but once they crossed into the other side, that was that. If she was being frank, part of Toivonen had expected that mischievous little demon to get them killed at some point or another. But as she pored over the reports, she stumbled upon an attached document from an intelligence support activity element, codenamed Obsidian Edge, detailing the intelligence they had gathered from this night they had taken prisoner. It was filled to the brim with detailed description of the social structure and general atmosphere of the Seraphic Empire and its vassal states. Granted, the information was filtered through the POW's somewhat schizophrenic perception, but it was still a goldmine compared to what they had been working with thus far. Suddenly, Toivonen's interest in this special forces team skyrocketed. With a few deft clicks of her mouse and some rapid-fire clacks on her keyboard, she pulled up a hoard of documents related to their mission. The team leader, Major Patrick Coleman, had been diligently cataloging their exploits in fine detail, and Toivonen eagerly devoured the intelligence analyst's assessments. The more she read, the more impressed she became. These operators were good. Damn good. In a matter of weeks, operating in a completely foreign environment, they had managed to gather a truly staggering amount of actionable intel and started the process of building the bridges needed for the operations she was looking to conduct. Leaning back in her chair, Toivonen crossed one leg over the other as her mind raced with the possibilities. Coleman, the intelligence chief muttered. It was as if she was tasting the name. Testing the weight of the name on her tongue. Toivonen bit her lower lip as she delved deeper into the files on this borderline rogue team. There was something special about this group, something that set them apart from the other units operating in the area. The way this. Coleman grasped and maneuvered his team through the human element of this conflict. It resonated with her on a fundamental level. They weren't just gathering intel or making contacts. They were engaging with the local population, building relationships, and leveraging those connections to further their mission. These men were the living embodiment of the old Special Forces spirit. Slipping into hostile territory and destabilizing the government or regime in such a manner they can be deemed neutralized. And by God, they were doing just that. The decision to execute the village head under the guise of a Geneva Convention clause, denying POW status to spies? It was a bold move, one that most commanders would have shied away from. But Coleman had made the call, and it had paid off in spades. The man even followed it up with a veritable puppet that was friendly towards US and NATO forces. And then there was the way they had connected themselves to the criminal underground of this alien world, inserting themselves into the power structures of a major town. It was a risky play, one that could have backfired spectacularly. As Toivonen read on, her respect for the man grew with each passing paragraph. He was taking risks, yes, but they were calculated risks, and each one was weighed against the potential benefits. But despite all this, there was a curious lack of details or even mentions about the problematic member of the man's team and the goddess. Toivonen leaned back in her chair, her mind whirring with the implications. She had read up on this individual and even met him during the negotiation with the goddess and her superiors. Elijah didn't show a shred of respect for authority then, and she knew he most likely wouldn't have been showing it now. It was almost as if Coleman was covering for them. Regardless, the networks Coleman and his team were building were the kind of deep, granular relationships that most in the CIA could only dream of. She needed to bring this man into her fold. If he could achieve this much operating independently, imagine what he could do with the full backing and resources of her organization. The possibilities were endless. The morning sun seemed to find its way through the wooden shutters and hit Elijah in the eyes, causing him to stir slowly. Slowly, the medic lifted his head off the pillow as a low groan escaped his lips. Squinting his eyes hatefully at the intrusive beam, Elijah shifted around and felt something tickle his face. As his scowl deepened, the man's hand reached up and plucked a few stray feathers from his tousled beard and hair from the plethora of pillows that surrounded him. The bed beneath him was not so much a bed as it was a nest, a cozy jumble of soft furs, plush cushions, and warm blankets that cradled his body. It was an odd arrangement, but one that had proven surprisingly comfortable. As his gaze listlessly wandered around the room, the sight of Bennett wrapped up in a tight cocoon in a similar nest caught him off guard. The engineer's mouth hanging half open in a comical imitation of a ghoul caused Elijah to stare incredulously for a few solid seconds before he began the process of throwing off furs and blankets. Too tired to laugh at him, Elijah turned his groggy head instead and took in his surroundings. The room itself was the very picture of fantasy charm. Everywhere he looked, he was given the impression of a cozy sanctuary with its sturdy and rustic wooden design and stone supports that added a certain timeless quality. It was like stepping into a scene from a novel or a video game full of magic and mystery. Then again, the magic and mystery here was very real. At the center of the room, a small fire crackled gently in the curiously designed hearth. Instead of a traditional chimney, the smoke was drawn up through a twisting, spiraling conduit that seemed to look like it took inspiration from a chemistry set. But what really grabbed his attention was what was burning. The logs that fed the fire were unlike any Elijah had ever seen. They were not the typical blocks of timber one would expect to find in a fireplace, but rather strange, gnarled things that seemed to take on a quality similar to obsidian but within an earthly green. They burned slowly, almost reluctantly, as if loath to give themselves to the consuming flames. Yet, for all their strange appearance, the logs gave off a gentle, comforting heat that bathed the room with a deep, orange glow. This warmth seeped into one's bones, chasing away the chill of the night and the lingering aches of the day's exertions. As Elijah sat up, his muscles protested in return from the abuse he had put it through over the past few weeks of constant torture and sleep deprivation. A high-pitched groan left his mouth as he threw his arms over his head and stretched out his weary muscles. Usually, he'd comment that he was too old for this shit, but Elijah noticed something strange. This was the first time in a long time he didn't feel like complete garbage. For someone who spent as long as he had in the soldiering profession would attest to the constant back, shoulder, and knee aches they would have experienced. It was a near-universal constant unless said soldier was a genetic freak or never spent a day in combat arms wrecking 80 to nearly 200 pounds of garbage on their back. Rubbing the last vestiges of sleep from his eyes, Elijah took a deeper look around the room. Light still spilled through the shutters and slowly drifted across the room as the sun shifted positions. For a moment, Elijah thought himself to be on some sort of vacation due to the far cry from the harsh fluorescent glare of the barracks or the harsh days of spending out in the elements. However, everything here seemed softer, more organic, and more alive. As he stood up, Elijah's hand went to his face as he sucked in a mouthful of air in a slow yawn that stretched out his jaw and neck muscles in a satisfying manner. His eyes were still heavy with the remnants of sleep, but he seemed more alert than ever, even as he lazily scanned the room in search of his little fairy companion. It had become a habit, a small ritual of sorts, to check on Yana first thing upon waking. But as his gaze drifted towards the fireplace, Elijah froze, his eyes snapping wide open. There, nestled against one of the strange, burning logs, was the massive, pitch-black egg he had swiped some time ago. And there, flitting around it in the midst of the flames, was Yana. For a moment, panic gripped Elijah's heart. The egg was completely engulfed in the fire, and Yana along with it. His mind raced, trying to comprehend what he was seeing. Had she accidentally knocked the egg into the flames? Was she trying to save it? But as he watched, his panic slowly subsided, replaced by a weary resignation. The egg was already in the fire, and Yana seemed completely unperturbed by the flames licking at her tiny form. In fact, she seemed to be fussing over the egg, tending to it with a strange, almost maternal attention. Elijah shook his head, a weary sigh left his lips. Of course. He should have known better than to worry. In her own words, Yana was a goddess, you know. A real one, you know. And as for the egg, well, it was probably too late to do anything about that now. Whatever was going to happen would happen. There was no sense in getting worked up about it. Twisting his body to get a better look at what she was doing, Elijah couldn't help but think about how possessive Yana had been of that egg ever since he'd stolen it during that ambush. It was a strange thing, with its strange, uneven surface that seemed more like hastily molten rock. And yet, for reasons known only to the capricious little fairy, it had become her most prized possession. He had sent everything else they'd acquired back aside with those activity spooks, save for a potion or two. But Yana? She had been adamant about keeping the egg. And after everyone had witnessed her light up that convoy like a Christmas tree, well, no one had the balls to tell her no. Because really, who in their right mind would try to take something from a literal immortal being that could vaporize you with a wave of their hand for the sake of a strange, oversized egg? No one, that's who. There wasn't a soul stupid enough to bother enough to try, and so, the little fairy kept the damn thing. What egg? I never saw no egg, was the prevailing sentiment. Sure, he had to haul the damn thing around like a mule, but if Elia was being honest with himself, he didn't really mind. Outside of her mischievous pranks and her incessant nagging, Yana didn't cause too many problems in actuality. She didn't ask for much beyond being a fatty and asking for a piece of anyone and everyone's food. She didn't bother anyone who wasn't her apostle. Tribute for their new goddess, she called it. Shaking his head, Elijah turned his attention back to the goddess and watched as she continued to fuss over the egg and dance around in the fireplace. He couldn't help but wonder what she was doing. She was clearly pouring a lot of something into it. Magic, energy, whatever it was that fueled her impossible existence. But to what end? With another high-pitched groan, Elijah stretched once more, marveling at how easily his muscles moved as he seemed to haul himself up from his nest. It was almost as if his muscles were starting to de-age and get some vitality back. He wanted to say that it was most likely due to his excitement about being in a weird new world full of weird new things, but as he looked over to his patron, he seemed to have a few suspicions as to the actual reason. Elijah wandered over to the fireplace and squatted down to get a closer look at Yana's mysterious ministrations. The egg seemed to pulsate and hum with each touch in the flickering flames. Arches of fiery violet shimmered around inside like a turbulent storm, making its obsidian surface nearly transparent. It was a rather mesmerizing display to see Yana darting in and out of the flames like a manic hummingbird as she gently touched the egg in different locations. "What are you doing, you little monster?" Elijah asked with a voice still rough with sleep. "You trying to cook the thing for breakfast?" Yana paused in her frenetic dance, turning to face Elijah with an expression of utter indignation. "Cook it," she scoffed as her tiny hands planted themselves on her hips. "Don't be ridiculous, Apostle." With a dramatic flourish, the fairy leaped onto one of the burning logs, throwing her hands up in the air in a celebratory fashion. "I'm nurturing our minion," she declared, her voice ringing with a strange mix of pride and mischief. Elijah stood there for a moment, with one eyebrow raised in a perfect arc of skepticism. "Wait," he replied, slowly trying to wrap his sleep-addled brain around her words. "You're not cooking it?" Yana jumped in place again, her arms once more thrown out in that same cheerful gesture. "No," her eyes sparkled with an almost maniacal glee. "I'm nurturing our minion." A bout of silence settled over Elijah as he scratched his head while a perplexed look etched onto his face. No matter what he did, he just couldn't quite reconcile the idea of an egg engulfed in flames with anything resembling nurturing. It just didn't compute. But deciding to humor the eccentric being, Elijah carefully considered her words. "What, like another servant or something?" he ventured, trying to make sense of her proclamation. Yana repeated her little dance, bouncing on the log with the same jubilant fervor that bordered on the unhinged. "No, our minion," she repeated once more, with a wide smile on her face. Elijah hummed thoughtfully as he straightened his posture and cast a thoughtful gaze around the room as if he were searching for answers in the rough-hewn walls and flickering shadows. "So," he said at last, turning back to Yana with a quizzical tilt of his head. "Someone like me?" He pointed to himself, a half-frown of confusion pulling at his mouth's corner. But Yana merely shook her head vigorously, her fiery hair whipping about like a banner in a storm. "No, a minion," she declared once more, her tone suggesting that this should be the most obvious thing in the world. The fairy's apostle stared at her with one hand over his mouth in a contemplative manner, before he started blinking to dispel the nonsense threatening to overwhelm his brain. Unable to distinguish what a minion meant to his supposed goddess, Elijah just shook his head and turned away from the fireplace. Trying to decipher the classification for a servant, an apostle, or whatever other category of underling she might dream up was a fruitless endeavor. But then again, trying to understand the workings of a fairy's mind, especially one as capricious and insane as Yana, was an exercise in futility. "Haha, what the fuck, man?" A rueful chuckle escaped Elijah's mouth as he made his way toward the pile of gear in the corner of the room, deciding that the mystery of Yana's minion-making was best left unsolved. He had more pressing matters to attend to, like getting dressed and ready for whatever fresh madness the day might bring. Rummaging through the assortment of clothes and equipment, Elijah pulled out another set of local garments that were a lot more casual. Instead of posing as the more mercenary type, he replaced the harsh leather armor with something that would help him blend in with the local townsfolk. As he dressed, Elijah made sure to tuck his pistol securely into the concealed holster at his waistband. Even in this more relaxed setting, he wasn't about to go completely unarmed. One never knew if they were being set up or what threats might lurk around the corner in this strange, unpredictable world. While adjusting his new clothes so his gun wouldn't show, Elijah wandered over to the window and peered out at the scene beyond. The town was already stirring to life, with bakers, shopkeepers, and the everyday pedestrians moving along to start their day. But what really caught his attention were children and smaller beings scurrying about. Like a fantasy version of a street sweeper, they ran around busily, pulling out and throwing into a basket on their back strange vines, flowers, and mushrooms that grew between the cracks of the stone road and snaked up the walls of the buildings. A hum of interest left Elijah's mouth as he watched their industrious work at the crack of dawn. Each time one of them would rip away a flower or mushroom, and the twisting vines would recoil and retreat back into the cracks they grew from. It was an interesting profession, and Elijah wondered just how much they got paid for such a laborious job. With the early morning sun sitting loftily on the horizon, Elijah turned back to the room to start his day and see what new adventure and opportunities it might hold. As he double-checked his gear, his gaze fell on the still slumbering Bennett, who was still wrapped tightly in his bedding. A mischievous grin spread across Elijah's face after he realized the engineer was completely vulnerable. Waltzing over to his bedding, Elijah grabbed a pillow from his own nest, and with a deft flick of his wrist, he sent the pillow sailing through the air in a perfect arc. He watched with satisfaction as it smacked Bennett squarely in the face, eliciting a startled snort from the sleeping man. His eyes fluttered open, and his body shook awake. "Wake up," Elijah called out, his voice far too cheerful for the early hour. "Let's go get something to eat and see what we can find out today." At the mention of food, Yana's tiny form shot up excitedly from her place by the fireplace. "Food," she yelled before immediately zipping over to hover near Elijah's shoulder. "You promised me food, Apostle. I command thee to fulfill thy sacred duty." Almost recoiling from the speed of the being, Elijah narrowed his eyes and raised one incredulous eyebrow. Won't your egg burn if you leave it?" he asked, gesturing towards the fire. But Yana merely waved her hand dismissively, with a look of utter confidence on her tiny face. "Bah, it'll be fine," she assured him, her tone brooking no argument. "Now go, mortal. I command thee." "As you wish, O mighty one," Elijah rolled his eyes before looking back to Bennett. "Hurry up, Ben. I want food." Bennett, meanwhile, was slowly extracting himself from his cocoon of blankets, grumbling under his breath as he blinked groggily in the morning light. He murmured, peering around in confusion with a completely frazzled look. "Food." The sleep engineer seemed to react at the mention of food, but his body remained stubbornly entangled in the nest of blankets. He pressed both hands into his eyes, groaning before flopping back down into his nest. It would take a while to untangle himself from this mess, but Bennett slowly started peeling off layers. Once he saw that an effort was being made, Elijah let out an amused huff, before heading towards the door. "Meet me downstairs," he called out as he checked his pistol again to make sure it was concealed. "I must see if there's anything ready." A grumble of affirmation left Bennett's mouth as he finally untangled himself and unsteadily stood up. He wanted to lay there for another moment, but the engineer sucked in a deep breath to muster the energy to face the day. As Elijah made his way out, Yana excitedly followed after, landing on his shoulder with a tiny thud. However, once she made her landing, the tiny goddess shook her feet, knocking still burning coals off as she cleaned herself. Elijah flinched away, brushing at his shoulder as he gave the little fairy a startled look. "Jesus!" he yelped as he glared at Yana. "You may not burn, but I certainly as fuck do," he grumbled as he made his way out the door and into the second-floor hallway. The tavern's more exclusive rooms were located on the far end of the rather large building, offering a degree of privacy and luxury that the common areas couldn't match. The hallway itself was well appointed, with rich wooden paneling and plush carpets that muffled his footsteps as he walked. But as soon as he reached the stairs, the luxury seemed to stop abruptly and was replaced with a rough, utilitarian aesthetic. As he descended into the dining area, Elijah noticed that the place was mostly empty, except for a few working girls. The few courtesans were either preparing the common area for the influx of patrons or lounging around. Regardless of what they were doing, they all seemed to turn to Elijah simultaneously and gave him a curious look. Every eye seemed to lash his form up and down as if appraising him with a mix of professional and personal intrigue. However, one of the girls was the same tan-skinned cat girl he saw last night. With dark auburn hair and a swishing tail, she dared to make her presence known and stepped forward, full of curiosity. The feline courtesan held a sultry smile and caught Elijah staring at her before, but as she approached, her gaze seemed to momentarily hone in on the tiny fairy perched on Elijah's shoulder. Her eyes widened, filled with the instinctual urge to catch the small, fluttering creature. However, she controlled herself, dragging her gaze back to the man in question with visible effort. "Sorry, Han," she purred, her voice a sultry drawl, "but breakfast isn't ready yet." She cupped her hands behind her back, leaning forward and tilting her head up to look at Elijah through her lashes so he could get a better look at her cleavage. "But, one of us might be able to offer you a quick round of service if you so wish." The implication was clear as day as she batted her eyes at him. Any friend of Mara is a friend of ours, after all. Her tail curled and uncurled in a come-hither motion. While the catgirl giggled seductively and circled him, Elijah closed his eyes and took a deep breath as he visibly struggled to control himself. The woman remained in her seductive pose as she sauntered around him. Meanwhile, Yana seemed to be copying the courtesan on Elijah's shoulder. A flash of bewilderment flashed through the catgirl's eyes as her gaze flickered from Yana and then back to Elijah. "What's wrong, Han?" she purred as a coy smile played on her lips. "Are you worried about your boss man?" Taking another deep breath, Elijah fought against the primal urges that surged through him. Here, standing before him, was the object of his deepest desires, his ultimate fantasy, a real, living, and breathing catgirl within arm's reach. It was an exercise in great restraint, and it took every ounce of his willpower not to reach out and pull her into his arms. Elijah's breath caught in his throat, his heart pounding against his ribs. The temptation was nearly overwhelming, the promise of fulfilling his deepest, most cherished fantasies right there within his grasp. His body screamed at him to accept, to throw caution to the wind and indulge in this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. But even as his primal urges surged, his rational mind rebelled. A slew of curses coursed through his mind when he thought of Coleman. He couldn't help but call a prudish, pedantic by-the-book son of a bitch. But with a Herculean effort, Elijah took a step back, distancing himself from the alluring feline. I appreciate the offer," he managed, his voice strained. "But I'm afraid I'll have to decline. For now." The catgirl flashed Elijah a toothy grin before she took a step closer. Her feline eyes darted all over his features as if studying every detail, before finally backing off with a mischievous glint in her eye. "Well, handsome," she purred, "if you change your mind, just come lookin' for Pina." With a flick of her tail, Pina glanced back towards the kitchen area. "But so that you know, the food won't be done for another hour or so." Letting out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, Elijah's body relaxed as the immediate temptation retreated. The frustrated man shook his head in derision and caught sight of Yana, who was perched on his shoulder and had a rather unimpressed look on her tiny face. "An hour?" the fairy grumbled, pouting, crossing her arms. "What am I gonna do for an hour without tribute?" Yana threw her arms up in outrage, causing her apostle to wear a complicated look on his face. "Tribute, apostle? I require tribute." There was a strange feeling brewing within Elijah. Not only could he discern Yana's impatience from what she said and how she acted, but he could actually feel it in some strange, intangible way. But with a shake of his head, Elijah dispelled these thoughts for the moment. The last thing he needed was for this little demon to cause a scene and draw more attention than they already had. "Hey, if any of my friends come down, could you tell them I stepped out for a bit?" Elijah's head drifted between Pina and the tavern entrance as an idea popped into his head. "I think I'll take a little walk and get some fresh air while you guys start breakfast." Pina's ears twitched with interest as she tilted her head, a playful smile tugging at her lips. "Sure thing, Han," she replied, her voice a sultry purr. She followed Elijah to the tavern's heavy doors, her hips swaying with each step, intent on seeing him off. As he made his way to the entrance, Elijah pushed open the door and let in a gust of fresh morning air while Pina leaned against the doorframe. Her tail swished back and forth in the air as she narrowed her eyes around the street, spotting the local muscle and freelancer meandering around. "Just a word of advice, Han," she said, her tone turning more serious. "Stay close to the Merchant's Row. The deeper you go into the town's heart, the rougher it gets." Elijah paused, turning to look at Pina with a raised eyebrow. "Rougher?" he asked with a note of curiosity in his voice. The courtesan nodded as her eyes narrowed slightly. "The gangs there aren't beholden to the rules and etiquette that's standard for ruffians when in the Gilded Courier's territory." That word seemed to ring out to Elijah like church bells as he furrowed his brow. His interest was piqued, and he felt as if he had found a rather notable point of interest. The Gilded Courier, he repeated, the unfamiliar term rolling off his tongue as he looked to Pina for an answer. But the cat girl remained tight-lipped, with the coy smile on her face becoming slightly strained. The quiet between the two lasted for a few more moments as Pina debated on how best to approach the subject. Don't worry about it, Han, just know that you behave when you're on the Gilded Courier's turf. She finally replied in a tone that said she was giving Elijah a warning. Hitching his breath, Elijah stopped the thoughtful hum that was going to leave his mouth and stared hard at the woman as his mind started to churn. He knew better than to press for more information, especially when it came to the inner workings of the criminal underworld. Instead, he simply nodded and gave Pina an understanding smile. I got it, he said, a hint of a smile on his face. I'll be sure to mind my manners. Pina gave him a satisfied grin, causing her sharp teeth to glint in the morning light. Good boy, she purred, reaching out to give Elijah's cheek a playful pat. Now run along and explore. But don't forget to keep out of trouble. She gave a wink and spun around to head back into the tavern. I'll be waiting right here for you when you get back, she added, throwing a look over her shoulder. Biting his lip as he watched the feline's hip sway, Elijah turned around himself to start his new little adventure. Guess I'll pester Ace about this. Gilded Courier later. He hummed to himself as he looked for the nearest food stall.